Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're curling into rest beneath a dim bedside lamp, tuning in on a night train through sleeping forests, or floating gently toward dreams, you've arrived at the right place. Because tonight, we journey into the ancient heart of Pangea, the world before the world was divided. Slow science and deep time, told softly for curious minds. This is the forgotten story of Earth's great togetherness. 250 million years ago, when every continent was one and life moved to the rhythm of a single superland under an ancient sky. But it's not just the tale of a world soon to fracture. It's the secret life that thrived in its stillness, strange, beautiful, and nearly lost. And if you're someone who finds wonder in tectonic dreams and silent fossils, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this kind of quiet storytelling reach more wandering sapiens like you. By the way, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it? Wherever you are, if you feel like sharing, drop it in the comments. It's a soft way to remember that we are not alone in the dark. And if your eyes grow heavy as we drift through deep time, that's okay. Timestamps are waiting for you below. Now, let's begin with a world before the continents let go. It is difficult to imagine the world as it once was, not simply in how it looked, but in how it felt. The air moved differently, the sky told different stories, and beneath it all lay a land that was, for a moment in deep time, utterly whole. Around 250 million years ago, during the cusp between the Permian and the Triassic periods, all of Earth's continents were joined together, not like puzzle pieces merely close in proximity, but truly one, a single colossal landmass that scientists have named Pangea from the Greek for all Earth. It sprawled from the frigid edges of the southern pole to the frozen reaches of the north. A planetary supercontinent, bordered by an equally vast superocean called Panthalassa. Pangea was not a symmetrical shape. Its form was lopsided, more like a smashed crescent than a globe-spanning disk. The western interior cut deep toward what we now call the equator, forming an immense inland basin. Around its edges, long mountain chains rose like stitches along a planetary scar. These were formed as ancient cratons, the stable cores of earlier continents collided and fused. One can still trace these scars today. The Appalachian Mountains in North America, the Anti-Atlas Range in Morocco, ridges that now lie continents apart, but were once joined, stone to stone. But what kind of world did this vast union create? The surface area of Pangea meant that many regions were profoundly isolated from the ocean. In today's world, nearly every spot on land lies within a few hundred kilometers of a sea. But the heart of Pangea may have been thousands of kilometers from the nearest shoreline. This distance had profound consequences. Without nearby oceans to moderate temperature or deliver moisture, the supercontinent's core was likely harsh and unyielding. Scientists believe the interior of Pangea was a place of extremes: scorching summers, freezing winters, powerful winds that swept across the open plains with little to stop them. The fossil record offers hints. Red beds, iron-rich desert rocks stretch across regions of present-day Africa, South America, and parts of Asia. These sediments suggest long-lasting arid climates under intense seasonal heat. Yet the edges of Pangea tell a different tale. There, evidence of swampy forests, shallow seas, and temperate zones begins to appear. A ring of life around a desert core. Even the winds would have moved differently. With so much of the landmass uninterrupted by oceans, global wind patterns may have flowed in sweeping arcs. Monsoons in the southern hemisphere, persistent westerlies in the north. The entire Earth's atmospheric engine turned by a different geography. And beneath it all, deep ocean currents circulated through Panthalassa. These were shaped not by many continents, but by one, a world of vast inertia. But how do we know any of this? The truth is, we don't know with certainty. What we do know comes from fragments, patterns in rock layers, chemical signatures left in ancient sediments, and the distribution of fossils across what are now distant continents. These clues, when arranged carefully, begin to sketch a picture of a singular land that once dominated the face of the planet. The evidence lies in the matching coastlines and shared geological formations. When the eastern edge of South America is placed beside the western coast of Africa, the match is uncanny. But beyond the shapes of continents, it's the rocks themselves that speak loudest. Mountain ranges that begin in Newfoundland continue in Ireland and Scotland. Coal beds in North America align with those in Europe, suggesting a once unified swampy expanse stretching across what we now divide by oceans. Paleomagnetism also offers insight. As lava cools, the iron crystals inside align with Earth's magnetic field, recording its direction like tiny compass needles. These signatures, frozen in stone, help scientists map the movements of the continents over time. When the magnetic fingerprints from different continents are compared, they often point in the same direction if, and only if, we imagine those continents were once joined. This strange alignment collapses into nonsense unless we accept that they were once one. Fossils offer another thread. The remains of the ancient reptile Mesosaurus appear in both Brazil and Namibia. It was a freshwater creature, too small and fragile to cross any ocean, yet its bones are found on both sides of the Atlantic. How could this be? The only explanation that fits the evidence is that these lands were once connected. Mesosaurus lived and died along the same river system, which now lies broken across two continents. The story deepens when we examine plant life. Fossils of the seed fern Glossopteris are found across the southern hemisphere in India, South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. These large, woody plants thrived in cool, moist environments. They painted wide swaths of the southern supercontinent in green during the Permian. And yet today, they're entombed beneath glaciers and deserts. Their spread, once broad and unified, now appears fractured and dislocated. But the pattern only becomes clear when the continents are pushed back together. Then, a forest reappears. This is the strange poetry of geology. The bones of ancient animals, the paths of magnetic minerals, the outlines of long-dead leaves, all of them whispering about a time when the earth was drawn into a single breath, a time before the world cracked. And yet, despite the clarity of the pattern, we must remain cautious. These reconstructions rest on interpretations, many of them still debated. The age of the rocks, the speed of continental drift, the exact timing of the supercontinent's birth and eventual rift. These details remain in flux. What the stones do not say directly, we are left to infer. Still, one picture keeps returning. A supercontinent rising from the seas. A unified land under a different sky. A world not yet broken, but already stirring. What forces, then, would begin to unmake something so vast? The answer, if there is one, lies not in the sky or on the surface, but deep below. Beneath Pangea's sprawling crust, the earth was restless. Mantle convection, the slow, churning movement of molten rock, was always at work. Like heat rising through a simmering stew, it pushed and pulled at the lithosphere above. The plates that carried continents were not static. They floated on a shifting sea of rock, driven by heat that had been building since Earth's earliest days. Somewhere in the vast underside of this unified world, mantle plumes may have begun to form. These columns of superheated material rose slowly from the deep mantle, pressing upward. In time, they would form domes in the crust, lifting and fracturing it. We believe that one such plume eventually birthed the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a region that would later rupture Pangea and give rise to the Atlantic Ocean itself. But in this moment, this brief interlude in geological time, the world was still whole. No Atlantic yet cut through it, no birds yet flew across its skies, and no humans walked upon its soil. The Triassic was beginning, and life was struggling to recover from the worst extinction event the planet had ever seen. But tectonic forces were already working, silently and slowly, far beneath the surface. It is easy to imagine Pangea as stable and unmoving, a supercontinent of permanence. But that illusion is a trick of timescale. What feels still to us is only a slowness beyond comprehension. Over tens of millions of years, continents twist and drift like puzzle pieces in slow motion. Their edges grind, oceans open and close, mountains rise and then fall into dust. Even in its most unified moment, Pangea carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. It was not a peaceful union, but a stressed and compressed one. Forces from earlier collisions remained locked in the crust tension, and pressure held tight, waiting for a release. Some researchers believe this internal stress made Pangea geologically unstable from the start. Like a branch bent too far, it could not hold its shape forever. And then there is time itself. Supercontinents, as far as we can tell, are not singular events. Earth has had others. Before Pangea, there was Rodinia. Before Rodinia, perhaps even Nuna. The pattern appears cyclical. The continents gather, they lock together, then they break apart again. A slow inhalation and exhalation of planetary plates. If Pangea was the breath held in, the exhale was already forming in the silence. So when we speak of Pangea as a world not yet broken, we speak of a fleeting wholeness. A unity measured not in days or years, but in geologic heartbeats. In that narrow window, around 250 million years ago, Earth's lands touched in a single, colossal gesture. Forests sprawled across equators. Rivers carved paths unbroken by ocean. Winds raced across half a world. And below it all, the mantle shifted. Even in its stillness, the world was already beginning to move. This movement, too slow for any eye to witness, left behind trails we can still follow. Not in the air, not in the soil, but etched deep within the bones of the earth itself. These traces are not obvious. They do not speak plainly. They whisper through alignments and absences, in layers of sediment and seams of ancient rock. But for those who have learned to read the language of stone, the message is unmistakable. The earth remembers where it once joined. Along the coasts of present-day continents, cliffs and outcrops reveal strata that mirror one another with uncanny precision. The western bulge of Africa, for instance, finds its match in the curvature of eastern South America. But beyond the shape of shorelines, there is something more compelling. The rocks themselves, their ages, their compositions, their fossils align, as though once part of a single quilt, torn and scattered. One of the most evocative examples comes from the Appalachian Mountains. Stretching down the eastern side of North America, these ancient ranges seem to vanish into the sea. But if you stand on the western edge of the British Isles, or walk the hills of Norway, you'll find their reflection. Geologists have shown that the Caledonian Mountains of Scotland and Scandinavia are part of the same orogenic belt created in the same continental collision hundreds of millions of years ago. When we align these landmasses back into their Pangean positions, the broken seams rejoin. These are the scars of an ancient collision, and they do not lie. Further south, across the lands that now make up Brazil and West Africa, similar patterns emerge. Cratonic rocks, some of the oldest on Earth, match in age and structure. The São Francisco Craton in Brazil finds its twin across the Atlantic in the Congo Craton. Like fingerprints pressed into molten history, they point to a time when these regions were side by side, long before ocean water ever rushed between them. But even more delicate than stone are the imprints left by life. Fossils, fragile and fragmented, form a second layer of evidence. The remains of species like Mesosaurus, a small freshwater reptile, appear in both South America and southern Africa. It is unlikely this animal swam across a saltwater ocean. Its anatomy suggests otherwise. It was not a creature of open seas, but of lakes and riverbanks. The presence of its bones on both continents only makes sense if those lands were once joined, part of the same watery landscape. What is striking is not the presence of these clues in isolation, but their global repetition. Reptile fossils in Africa that also appear in India, ferns in Antarctica that match those in Australia, mountain chains, mineral veins, and sediment layers that continue across oceans. These echoes in the stone speak not of coincidence, but of unity. The continents remember when they were one, yet some of the most compelling memories are not carved by life or shaped by mountain-building collisions. They are etched into the very orientation of the Earth's magnetic field, preserved in cooled volcanic rock. This is the quiet science of paleomagnetism. and it offers one of the most eloquent proofs of Pangea's existence. When molten rock erupts and begins to cool, the iron-rich minerals within align themselves with the direction of Earth's magnetic field at that moment in time. These minerals freeze in place, preserving a magnetic signature, like a snapshot of the ancient sky. Over time, this record becomes layered of fossil, not of bones, but of invisible force. By comparing the paleomagnetic signatures from rocks on different continents, scientists have found that they once shared the same magnetic orientation, but only if those continents are repositioned, as they would have been during the age of Pangea. Without such repositioning, the data creates chaos. The magnetic directions appear to contradict each other. Rocks of the same age in South America and Africa suggest different latitudes and orientations if we assume they were always apart. But when we reverse the drift, when we move the continents back into place, the signals align. Like puzzle pieces with matching grain, they click together. This line of evidence is powerful because it's not subject to many of the interpretive uncertainties that come with fossil distribution. Magnetic alignment cannot migrate across oceans. It cannot be explained by similar climate or convergent evolution. It must come from physical proximity, from shared tectonic history. And then there is glacial evidence, preserved not in ice, but in the patterns it left behind. Around 280 million years ago, during the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods, large parts of the southern continents experienced glaciation. But the directions of glacial striations, the scratch marks left by moving ice, point outward from what is now a scattered mess. In present-day geography, the patterns do not make sense. But if we place South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, and Australia into the configuration of Gondwana, the southern portion of Pangea, the striations converge beautifully. They radiate outward from a single polar ice sheet, as they should. The geometry only fits if the continents were joined. It is in these strange alignments that the Earth gives away its secrets. A fossil here, a mountain ridge there, a frozen compass needle locked in basalt. Each clue alone is interesting. Together, they form a constellation of evidence scattered across the globe, pointing to one conclusion. These lands we now see as separate, drifting on tectonic plates, were once bound by proximity and purpose. Their bones still carry the memory of that closeness, and yet there is another kind of evidence, one that speaks not through shape or orientation, but through absence and silence. What might the gaps in the story be trying to tell us? Sometimes, the strongest evidence lies in what no longer fits, in the edges that do not quite align, in the strange absences where ecosystems should continue but don't. These interruptions, these quiet breaks in continuity, are themselves part of the story of Pangea. One example emerges from coal deposits. Across Europe and North America, massive coal seams stretch beneath modern cities and rural landscapes alike. These were once lush, swampy lowlands, carbon-rich environments, teeming with primitive plants, ferns, and insects the size of seagulls. But when we examine where these coal beds end, they do so not with a fade, but with a fracture. Entire sequences of organic-rich strata abruptly vanish at continental margins, only to reappear thousands of kilometers away on the opposite side of an ocean. When we digitally reconstruct the continents, those seams reconnect. A single, expansive Carboniferous wetland comes back into view, its edges once joined, now torn apart by time and drift. It is a pattern repeated across biomes. Sedimentary basins, river deltas, even ancient fault zones, all begin to make coherent sense only when we reverse the drift. It is as if the Earth itself is waiting to be read backwards. But it is not only geologists who see these echoes. Paleontologists too, in their quiet labour among broken bones and scattered teeth, stumble upon the memory of a world not yet broken. Species of Triassic reptiles that should have diverged by isolation appear instead across 3, sometimes 4, modern continents. The suggestion is not that these animals swam or flew vast distances. Rather, they simply walked across land that no longer exists. The same is true of plants. Fossilized pollen grains, microscopic and nearly invisible, have been discovered in matched deposits in India, Madagascar, and Antarctica. These grains, carried on the wind long before flowering plants existed, settled into swamps that are now separated by oceans. They are the softest of records, and yet they survive, entombed in mudstone and shale. Even climate patterns become clearer when viewed through the lens of Pangea. The great sand dune systems of the Triassic, known today as ergs, appear across North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. The famed Navajo sandstone in the southwestern United States shares structural similarities with formations in the UK and Germany. Together, they suggest the presence of a single massive desert belt that once cut across the northern latitudes of Pangea, a wind-shaped monument to the supercontinent's size and openness. And so we are left with a picture that emerges not in one place, but across many. Rock, bone, magnetic trace, plant fossil, each alone is a whisper. Together, they speak in chorus, a geological memory not held in any one stone, but in the pattern between them. This is the nature of deep time. It leaves no photographs, no ruins to explore, only echoes, and we, fragile and late arriving, must gather them carefully if we want to hear the whole. But how do we understand life itself in a world so vast and unforgiving? To begin imagining that life, we must first accept how close it came to ending altogether. The close of the Permian period, just before the Triassic dawned, brought with it a devastation unlike anything before or since. Over 90% of marine species vanished. Nearly 3/4 of all terrestrial vertebrates disappeared. The biosphere faltered, nearly erased by an extinction so severe that paleontologists call it the Great Dying. Its causes remain debated. Massive volcanic activity in what is now Siberia released untold volumes of carbon dioxide and methane. Oceans turned acidic. Oxygen levels plummeted. The planet itself overheated. Forests collapsed. Fungal spores bloomed in the fossil record, replacing ferns and conifers with decay. In this vacuum, time slowed. Recovery took millions of years, and yet, somewhere within the scorched interior of Pangea, life began to stir. It was not lush, it was not fast. The early Triassic world was dominated by barren open expanses. Much of the supercontinent's heartland was parched and windswept, with little shade and fewer nutrients. Where once swamp forests had stretched from pole to pole, now there were patches. Scattered flora, hardy survivors like Pterosaurs, a spore-bearing plant that resembled a giant quill, rose in isolation, their trunks stretching toward an unforgiving Sunday. These plants were pioneers. They could tolerate poor soil and searing heat. Their very presence hinted at a resilience forming beneath the surface. Among them crawled the remnants of a decimated animal kingdom. The dominant vertebrates were no longer the mammal-like synapsids that had ruled the Permian. Many of those lineages were now extinct or barely surviving in small, increasingly marginal niches. The world was open again, and nature, cautious, bruised, but persistent, began a slow repopulation. It was in this moment that archosaurs began to emerge. Not yet the towering dinosaurs of the later Mesozoic, but smaller forms, slender, agile, and sharp-eyed. Creatures like Euparkeria, a lightly built predator with powerful hind limbs and a long snout, made their appearance in what is now South Africa. Its fossils suggest a flexible stance, perhaps sometimes walking upright, scanning the sparse undergrowth for insects and small prey. Archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to both crocodilians and dinosaurs, found something in this bleak world that favored them. Their upright limbs allowed them to move more efficiently. Their body structure supported more advanced respiration, possibly allowing them to survive in low oxygen conditions. They did not inherit the earth. They adapted to it. Far from the coastlines, in the searing red beds of the interior, such creatures began to spread. The fossil record tells us little about how many species existed or what their daily lives looked like. But we find their bones in enough places, across what would become multiple continents, to believe they were establishing a quiet foothold. And still, life remained fragile. It had not yet flourished. It was holding on, just enough for evolution to begin its slow, methodical repair. Even with such tenuous beginnings, something important was taking root. The evolutionary clock had not stopped. It had merely paused, silenced under the weight of extinction. Now, as temperatures stabilized and atmospheric oxygen began its slow rebound, a new caste of organisms began to appear, shaped not by abundance, but by scarcity. One of the key patterns emerging in the early Triassic was ecological simplicity. Food chains were shorter. Specialization was rare. Most organisms were generalists, adaptable, opportunistic, able to eat whatever they could find. In a world of shallow roots and thin canopies, being flexible was not optional. It was the only way forward. In the arid basins of the supercontinent's interior, the Lystrosaurus was among the most successful vertebrates. A squat, tusked herbivore with a barrel-shaped body and beaked mouth, it was a synapsid part of the same lineage that would one day lead to mammals. Fossils of Lystrosaurus have been found in Antarctica, India, South Africa, and China. Few species have been as widespread in both geography and fossil abundance. For a time, it dominated the landscape, often comprising the majority of vertebrate fossils in certain sediment layers. Why did it thrive when so much else perished? Its physiology may offer clues. Some researchers suggest it could burrow, escaping the brutal daytime heat. Its lungs may have been adapted to low oxygen conditions. Its diet, likely composed of tough, low-nutrient plants, may have required minimal competition. It was not a beautiful creature, but it was built to survive. Meanwhile, the skies remained largely empty. Insects had not yet recovered their full diversity. The world lacked the humming and buzzing of complex food webs. Birds had not evolved. Pterosaurs, the first flying vertebrates, were still many millions of years away. The air above the early Triassic plains was quiet, unbroken by wings, but in the shallow waters and near coastal lagoons, life was beginning its own quiet revolution. Early amphibians, such as Gerathorax, a flat-headed predator with a wide, immobile jaw, haunted the slow-moving rivers. Its eyes sat atop its skull, peering up through the murk. Some forms may have retained gills even into adulthood. Others may have relied on skin respiration. These were creatures that blurred boundaries, not yet fish, not quite fully land dwellers, survivors of a lineage far older than Pangea itself. Though marine life had suffered terribly in the extinction, the oceans began their own reassembly of ecosystems. Bivalves and ammonoids returned quickly. New coral groups began to appear, though true reef systems would take much longer to recover. In time, marine reptiles would rise to dominance. But in these early chapters, the oceans mirrored the land, quiet, wounded, and rebuilding. It was a world made of thresholds, forms half-finished, systems half-healed. Nothing yet claimed dominance. Every life form that stirred did so cautiously, in a landscape where the rules had been reset. What did it take, then, for complexity to return? Perhaps it began not with a leap, but with a foothold. Small changes in anatomy, slight advantages in gait, metabolism, or feeding strategy. As the Permian silence faded into the Triassic hum, new ecological space opened. The land was not forgiving, but it was vast. And in that vastness, evolution had room to experiment. The archosaurs, still modest in size and distribution, began to explore niches left unoccupied. Some grew longer limbs, favoring speed. Others thickened their hides. Fossils like Proterosuchus, found in what is now South Africa, suggest a long-snouted carnivore, low-slung, and possibly semi-aquatic. It may have been a scavenger, or perhaps an ambush predator, lurking near streams that only rarely flowed. The evidence is limited, and we cannot say for certain, but its presence marks a shift toward more active predation. Farther north, in the interior basins of Pangea, archosaur relatives were diversifying as well. Though their fossils are sparse, trackways left in hardened mud suggest the movements of small, upright walkers. Three-toed impressions, narrow gaits, rapid directional shifts. These were not heavy, lumbering beasts. They were quick, observant, possibly even social, and they were preparing, slowly, to fill the vacuum left behind by extinction. Flora, too, began to reclaim territory. In time, hardy seed ferns and conifers expanded beyond the coastal margins. With them came insects, beetles, primitive flies, and early relatives of dragonflies. Not yet the tangled symbiosis of flowering plants and pollinators, but the first whispers of ecological collaboration. Spores rode on the wind again. Root systems dug deeper. Shade returned in patches. Still, the interior of Pangea remained harsh. The distance from the ocean meant seasonal extremes. Heat during the day, bitter cold at night. Rainfall came and went unpredictably. There is evidence that monsoon-like systems influenced the supercontinent, but the inland plains likely saw long stretches of drought. Flora and fauna alike had to survive through resilience, not abundance. And yet, the groundwork was being laid. Over millions of years, new predator-prey relationships formed. Energetic animals hunted in open terrain. Plants evolved new structures to cope with poor soil and wind exposure. Burrows, nests, migration. These behaviors, subtle at first, helped life recover. And more importantly, they began to diversify. By the Middle Triassic, just 30 million years after the Great Dying, ecosystems had regained much of their complexity. Synapsids faded into the background. Archosaurs grew bolder. Life didn't just survive. It began to transform. The fossil record from this time is thin. Many gaps remain, but in the strata we do have scattered across what are now separate continents, the pattern is clear. From the margins of extinction, a new world had started to emerge. Different from the one before. More experimental, more fragmented, but alive. And within that quiet turning of Earth's history, one lineage in particular was beginning to rise. Not yet dominant, not yet enormous, but biding its time in the sun-baked shadows of a world still healing. What clues, then, did this fragile landscape leave for us to follow? There were clues, patterns in the rock, chemical signals in ancient oceans, fossil beds that held more gaps than bones. From these fragments, a haunting picture begins to form. Something terrible happened in the final days of the Permian, and whatever it was, it reached deep into the biosphere, hollowing out nearly all of life. This was not just an extinction. It was Earth's most severe ecological reset. By some estimates, over 90% of marine species vanished. On land, nearly 70% of vertebrate genera disappeared. Forests collapsed. Insects typically resilient through smaller extinction events suffered significant losses. Coral reefs disappeared entirely for millions of years. Even microbial life showed signs of stress. The biosphere fell quiet. But what made this catastrophe so total? And how did Pangea itself contribute to the silence that followed? The supercontinent, vast and singular, held within it an unstable climate. Without the moderating influence of nearby oceans, Pangea's interior likely swung between blistering heat and sudden cold. Monsoonal patterns formed near the coasts, but the inland deserts remained dry and harsh. These extreme shifts could have made the land especially vulnerable when crisis arrived. And the crisis was global. The Siberian traps, a region in what is now Russia, erupted violently near the end of the Permian. These were not singular explosions. They were massive flood basalt events, lasting perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. Lava poured across the land. But it was not the molten rock that caused the most harm. It was what came with it. Greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide in unimaginable volumes. Methane released from permafrost and seabeds. The atmosphere thickened. Temperatures soared. In the oceans, rising warmth reduced the oxygen content. Stagnant water columns formed. In some places, the deep sea became anoxic, devoid of oxygen. Hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas, may have bubbled up from the depths. The chemistry of the planet changed. What had been breathable, livable, survivable, became hostile. Fossils from shallow marine environments reveal sudden disappearances. Brachiopods, trilobites, ammonoids. Species that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years vanished from the record almost overnight. On land, synapsids and amphibians, once diverse and widespread, dwindled to a few surviving lineages. Even microbial mats in soil and reef-building communities in oceans collapsed. The entire structure of ecosystems was dismantled. And then, nothing. The early Triassic fossil record is disturbingly sparse. For several million years, biodiversity remained low. Recovery was sluggish. The Earth had survived, but just barely. And it was quiet. This is the eerie period that followed the Great Dying, a stretch of time when the world was technically alive, but unmistakably hollowed out. Ecosystems were thin, food webs short, niche specializations rare. The reignition of life was slow, cautious, and uneven. Many regions likely remained biologically barren for generations. Life did not return in triumph. It returned in fragments. But perhaps the most haunting detail is this. Recovery was not linear. It came in waves. And some of those waves were pulled back before they could crest. Evidence from sedimentary layers suggests that extinction pulses continued for several million years into the early Triassic. Brief attempts at ecological flourishing were followed by sharp collapses. What may have seemed like the beginning of resilience turned out to be a false dawn. This pattern of false starts indicates that the conditions which caused the extinction were not immediately resolved. The Earth remained volatile. The prolonged instability may have been intensified by the geography of Pangea. With so much landmass concentrated into a single supercontinent, the effects of global warming were amplified. Vegetation, sparse across the interior, offered little in the way of carbon absorption. Runoff from exposed soils may have choked rivers and shallow seas. The lack of buffering coastlines meant that extreme weather events could stretch unimpeded across thousands of kilometers. Atmospheric modeling suggests that Pangea's interior experienced powerful seasonal swings, dry spells, that could last years, interrupted by violent storms. Monsoonal rains likely flooded vast areas before disappearing again. These patterns made it difficult for stable ecosystems to take root. Any species that tried to specialize would have struggled to adapt. The only survivors were those able to endure uncertainty. Geochemical data from ancient soils, known as paleosols, confirms that high levels of carbon dioxide lingered well into the Triassic. Some estimates place global temperatures as high as 50 degrees Celsius in certain regions. If true, then much of Pangea's heartland may have been uninhabitable for long stretches. Only the coastal margins and highlands would have offered refuge. Yet even these zones bore scars. The fossil record shows that conifers, lycophytes, and ginkgos, some of the hardiest plant groups, were reduced to scattered, localized populations. Tree rings from surviving specimens show signs of stress, interrupted growth, water shortages, sudden cold snaps. Life was not only reduced in number, it was living under constant duress. And still, in that silence, the Earth was not finished changing. Volcanism continued in pulses. Tectonic forces shifted. The planet's rotation, orbital tilt, and atmospheric currents worked in unpredictable rhythm. Every species that stirred in the dust of extinction was doing so beneath skies filled with ash, over soils scraped bare. The memory of what had come before lingered, not as fossils but as absence, an entire layer of the past erased. We do not know what it felt like to live then. But the rocks suggest that it was not a place of abundance or hope. It was a world caught in the tension between death and emergence, a world where existence itself had become a question. And yet, existence answered, slowly, quietly. Against odds we can scarcely imagine. Life began again, not through a single spark or sudden bloom, but through persistence. A fern growing from ash, a reptile adjusting to thinner air, a river filling again after a dry decade. The survivors of the Permian extinction were not just lucky. They were adaptable, flexible, willing to take risks on a planet still healing. This slow crawl back into complexity was shaped by Pangea's geography as much as it was by evolution. The great size of the supercontinent meant that recovery happened in patches, isolated zones of stability near rivers, along coasts. In shaded uplands became crucibles of experimentation. In these fragmented oases, life began to tinker again. Some synapsids, clinging to survival, evolved new feeding strategies, burrowing, scavenging, developing more efficient respiratory systems. The Lystrosaurus once again emerges as a symbol of this era. Not elegant, not large, not fierce, but widespread. Its fossils appear in Antarctica, India, and South Africa, suggesting an animal that was not only persistent, but able to move across broad terrains. In these same regions, early archosaurs began their quiet ascent, still small, still outnumbered, but increasingly suited to the shifting climates. Their limbs were positioned more directly beneath their bodies. They could travel longer distances, breathe more efficiently, hunt with more precision. The oceans, too, began to stir. While coral reefs remained absent, other forms of marine life began to flourish again. Bivalves spread quickly. Ammonoids returned with extraordinary speed, diversifying into new shapes. Early ichthyosaurs, marine reptiles shaped like streamlined dolphins, began to explore the recovering seas. Their fossils, though fragmentary, suggest a return to movement, to open water, to a new kind of predation. This quiet rebuilding did not undo the damage. The biodiversity lost during the Great Dying would take over 10 million years to approach its former levels. Some lineages vanished forever, but what emerged in their place was not a replica. It was something new, a world made not from what survived, but from what adapted. And here, in the muted recovery of the early Triassic, we begin to see the outlines of the world to come. The rise of archosaurs, the spread of seed-bearing plants, the reorganization of ecosystems not around stability, but around flux. The silence never fully returned, but its echo lingered. Perhaps this is what deep time teaches best, that even the worst moments in Earth's history do not end with finality. They end with a pause, a breath, and then a stirring. But how did that new breath shape the future rulers of the land and sky? Those new breaths of life, tentative and rare, rose into an atmosphere that was anything but gentle. Evolution was restarting, but the world itself was still gripped by extremes. While scattered ecosystems clung to rivers and coastlines, the vast interior of Pangea offered little in the way of shelter. It was a land stretched across latitudes, locked in a shape that denied comfort, and in its heart the winds began to howl. To stand in the center of Pangea, were it possible, would be to stand in a place unlike any that exists today. Thousands of kilometers from the nearest ocean, the supercontinent's inner reaches were too far removed from the stabilizing influence of water. Without moisture-laden winds, the skies often remained empty. Rains that touched the coasts rarely survived the long journey inland. This distance created a climate of staggering contrasts. What little evidence we have from sedimentary records points to hyperaridity, not just dry, but unrelentingly so. In regions now part of Central Asia, North America, and Northern Africa, red beds dominate the Triassic strata. These iron-rich sediments, often oxidized by exposure to dry air, suggest vast desert landscapes, dune formations, cracked mudstone, riverbeds that filled once, perhaps twice a year. The marks of drought are written in layer after layer of silence. Temperature swings in these regions were likely brutal. During the day, solar radiation poured down on exposed rock. With no tree canopy, no thick vegetation to shade or cool, the heat accumulated without resistance. Surface temperatures may have soared to well above 40 degrees Celsius. And then, as night fell, the heat fled. Without humidity to trap warmth, the ground chilled rapidly. Organisms that endured these lands had to cope not with one kind of hardship, but two: blistering heat followed by bone-deep cold every single day. Wind was the only constant. It moved freely across the flat plains of central Pangea, gathering dust, sculpting dunes, and stripping away what little organic matter remained. These winds were not mild breezes. They were massive atmospheric systems, looping around a continent with no significant mountain ranges to break their force. Sandstorms may have lasted for days. Pressure systems shifted violently. The Earth's spin dragged the jet streams along unfamiliar paths. In this unbroken expanse, the climate breathed with an intensity we can only model. Some researchers believe the global climate system during this time was organized around a massive mega-monsoon, a seasonal reversal of winds and rain, driven by the thermal imbalance between Pangea's landmass and Panthalassa, the vast surrounding ocean. But this pattern was uneven. While the margins of the supercontinent may have received bursts of seasonal rain, the interior remained largely untouched. The monsoons died long before reaching the heartland. What was left behind was a furnace, a dust bowl, a silence broken only by the rasp of wind over stone. The strange irony is that while Earth had become one land, it had also become more divided than ever before. The coastlines teemed with slow regeneration. Ferns reappeared. Rivers found their courses again. Insects began to evolve new forms. But farther inland, the story was different. The supercontinent's massive bulk created continentality, a term used to describe climates shaped by distance from the ocean. On Pangea, this effect was amplified beyond any modern comparison. Today, the largest landmasses on Earth are broken by coastlines, interrupted by mountain ranges, sliced by rivers, and cooled by lakes. Even Central Asia, considered remote, is only a few thousand kilometers from major seas. But Pangea's interior may have stretched nearly 10,000 kilometers from shore to shore. The heat stored during long summer days was not distributed evenly. It pooled in basins, radiated across bare plateaus, and burned through the surface soils. Plants withered before roots could take hold. One of the best records of these conditions comes not from fossils of animals or plants, but from evaporites, mineral deposits left behind by the evaporation of shallow, inland water bodies. These include salts, gypsum, and anhydrite. Found in formations across modern-day North America, Europe, and Asia, these minerals are indicators of ancient lakes and seas that formed briefly during wetter periods, then vanished under relentless Sunday. The layers are thick, repeated, and widespread. They tell the same story again and again. Water came, water left. Nothing endured. The heat wasn't the only challenge. The atmosphere itself was different. With carbon dioxide levels several times higher than today, greenhouse conditions intensified the thermal gradient between land and sea. Air masses rose quickly over the supercontinent's surface, creating high-altitude currents that further disrupted global climate patterns. It may have even created thermal low pressure systems, so powerful that they redirected wind flow across hemispheres. The land breathed heat, the sky carried it. It is difficult to fully reconstruct this climate in models. Many variables remain uncertain. The tilt of the Earth, the orbital eccentricity, the cloud feedback systems. But sedimentary evidence agrees on one thing: the vast interior was inhospitable. Fossils from these regions are rare. Plant material is almost absent. Bones are scattered, few and far between. The land was not dead, but it was indifferent. Evolution happened along the margins. In the middle, life waited. And yet, even in these harsh environments, some organisms found a way. Small burrowing animals may have survived in cooler pockets beneath the surface. Wind-blown spores from distant plants may have taken brief hold before being scorched away. Trace fossils, footprints, burrows, ripple marks hint at moments of passage. A creature crossing the dust. A lizard-like form digging for shade. Their stories are incomplete, but they offer glimpses of defiance. The land punished specialization. Only the most adaptable could endure. And even then, they did so with effort. One of the greatest difficulties for scientists today is not imagining how brutal the interior of Pangea might have been, but understanding how any life survived it at all. The answer, perhaps, lies in the small, in extremophiles, as we call them today. Creatures that tolerate salt, heat, desiccation, and radiation. While we cannot say whether such organisms existed in the same form during the Triassic, their modern analogues offer clues. In dry valleys, crusts of microbes can persist without rain for decades. In shallow caves, temperature fluctuations are muted, allowing small species a narrow margin of safety. These are the strategies that may have allowed survival, not conquest, but clinging. Some of the oldest soils on Earth show signs of cryptogamic covers, thin biological crusts composed of cyanobacteria, algae, and lichens. These structures stabilize soil, fix nitrogen, and pave the way for vascular plants. In the interior of Pangea, such systems may have been crucial. Without forests or grasses, the ground would have been vulnerable to erosion. A single sandstorm could wipe away the conditions needed for life. But, if these microbial layers existed, they may have helped buffer the surface. They would have created microhabitats, tiny pockets of possibility. But make no mistake, this was a world of scarcity. Plants that managed to grow in these regions would have been adapted to dry conditions. Succulent tissues, deep root systems, spore dispersal by wind, not insects. If forests existed at all, they would have been stunted and widely spaced. More likely, the vegetation resembled scattered scrublands, clusters of conifers, isolated stands of horsetails, nothing that could stop the wind. And that wind, relentless and dry, shaped more than just the landscape. It shaped biology. Creatures evolved streamlined forms to reduce heat load, lighter colors to reflect the Sunday, behaviors timed to the cooler hours of dusk and dawn. Evolution did not create new giants here. It created survivors. In this silence, this burning stillness, the earth was reshaping itself, not with catastrophe, but with constancy. Every grain of sand moved by wind. Every plant that failed to sprout. Every day that ended without rain. These were the forces that carved the future. What is most striking is that this harsh environment may have acted not as a void, but as a crucible, a testing ground. Because those that endured would carry traits forged in fire: adaptability, endurance, metabolic efficiency, traits that would serve their descendants well in a changing world. And somewhere along the margins of this burning center, the first of the giants was stirring. How did the winds of Pangea help sculpt the rise of Earth's next great creatures? Traits forged in fire may have defined the interior, but along the outer edges of the supercontinent, a different world was taking shape. These coastal zones, kissed more frequently by oceanic winds and summer rains, offered the gentle conditions the heartland could not. Here, the planet began to remember what it meant to grow in abundance. Unlike the dust-blown deserts and salt-crusted basins inland, the periphery of Pangea had a very different story to tell. Moisture carried across thousands of kilometers of open sea, condensed into clouds that spilled rain upon ancient shorelines. The monsoons that died in the desert were born again on these coastal plains. What they left behind was a network of rivers, deltas, and lowland valleys, ideal environments for forest recovery. The flora of the margins included species both familiar and strange. Towering conifers, ancestors of the pines and cypresses we know today, began to rise again. Their needle-like leaves were adapted to survive both drought and storm, and their cones protected the next generation from wind and predation. Beneath them grew cycads, short and squat plants with stiff, palm-like fronds. They had already been on Earth for millions of years, but in these warm, wet climates, they found a renewed foothold. Most striking were the ginkgos, with their fan-shaped leaves and curious branching patterns. Fossils suggest that they once ranged far and wide, from the eastern regions of what would become Asia to the western fringes of modern-day Europe. Their resilience was matched by their quiet elegance. In the margins of Pangea, they spread beneath the canopy, soaking up diffuse sunlight and damp soil. This was a different kind of green world. Not a tangled jungle in the modern sense, but a patchwork of forested zones where species competed gently and evolved slowly. Insects, long diminished, began to return. Beetles, moths, and primitive grasshoppers reappeared among the leaf litter. Fungi rebuilt the decaying layers of the forest floor. Even millipedes and early arachnids found their place in this shaded rebirth. Each ecological level built upon the one beneath it. The trees provided structure, the undergrowth provided shelter, the detritus fed the soil, and the soil, in turn, held the water. These feedback loops, absent in the harsh interior, were intact here, and with them came complexity. Streams meandered through these forests, feeding wetlands that attracted early amphibians. Pools, shaded and cool, allowed larvae to mature. Predators, both aquatic and terrestrial, took advantage. Here, in the liminal spaces between land and water, life was beginning not just to recover, but to flourish. Still, this growth was tentative. The world remained fragile. A single drought could kill hundreds of trees. Fires could sweep through unchecked. But compared to the inland deserts, the coastal forests felt almost Edenic. They were places where life had a chance to stretch upward again, where shade returned, and with it, new forms of shelter. Shelter, in this new world, was not a luxury. It was a strategy. The creatures who made their homes beneath the ginkgos and within the thickets of conifers evolved in the presence of refuge. The margins of Pangea became a testing ground for behavioral complexity. Burrows, nests, communal insect mounds, these began to appear alongside the renewed vegetation. Shelter was not simply protection from predators. It was insulation from rain, buffer from heat, and in some cases, a place to raise the next generation. Forests created microclimates. Beneath the canopy, temperature and humidity fluctuated less dramatically than in the open air. For small-bodied animals, this meant survival. Many of the early archosaur relatives, svelte-bodied reptiles with nimble limbs and sharp eyesight, likely hunted along these forest floors. They darted between roots, waited in the underbrush, and ambushed prey with sudden bursts of speed. Their fossils are rare, but the evidence suggests that they were diversifying in both form and behavior. This was also the domain of the insectivores. Small synapsids, possibly nocturnal, moved quietly through the leaf litter. Their teeth show signs of specialization, not for tearing flesh, but for crushing exoskeletons. In their jaws we see the first hints of what would, much later, become mammalian complexity, differentiated teeth, agile limbs, and perhaps even fur. Fossilized wood from these regions offers a glimpse of the forests themselves. Growth rings, unlike those found in the stressed interior, are wider and more regular. This suggests sustained periods of rainfall and warmer winters. Tree trunks preserved in ancient floodplains show signs of damage and regrowth, proof of a dynamic environment, but one that permitted recovery. The wetlands in particular were teeming with quiet transformation. Amphibians thrived in the warm shallows. From salamander-like forms to large, crocodile-sized predators, they occupied the edges of lakes and rivers. Their fossils often appear alongside fossilized plant roots and fish scales. These were ecosystems in balance, not yet rich, but stable enough to persist. And above it all, new light filtered through the leaves. Not the scorching rays of the inland sun, but a soft, dappled radiance. It illuminated the forest floor in shifting patches. It warmed the backs of cold-blooded animals. It nurtured spores and fed algae growing in the shallows. Where the desert punished risk, the forest encouraged it. Insects could evolve elaborate courtship. Plants could experiment with new seed dispersal. Vertebrates could push into unoccupied niches. Every organism that lived here lived within a network. And that network, in turn, allowed complexity to re-emerge. Still, the forest edge was not immune to the volatility of the larger world. Volcanic activity continued across other regions. Sea levels shifted. The Earth's climate, though softening, remained unpredictable. Yet here, in the leafy margins, life took the risk, and in doing so, it began to change. Change, in evolutionary time, is both slow and dramatic. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the forests that fringed the great inland deserts of Pangea. As the Triassic progressed, these peripheral ecosystems became crucibles of experimentation. With every passing million years, new lineages emerged. Some would vanish quickly, their adaptations poorly suited to the shifting balance. Others would linger. A few would thrive. It is within this context that the first true dinosaurs likely found their footing. Not yet giants, not yet rulers of the land, but small, bipedal forms that crept along the margins, light-footed and cautious. Nyasasaurus, for instance, found in what is now Tanzania, may have walked among such forests. While debate continues over whether it qualifies as a true dinosaur, its anatomy suggests a transitional form, long limbs, elongated neck, and hints of rapid growth rates. These features hint at a body in transition, optimized for speed and survival. The availability of diverse microhabitats in the coastal woodlands may have provided the evolutionary fuel for such experiments. Shade-loving plants created dark, humid zones. Upland ridges offered drier, cooler conditions. Seasonal floodplains brought in aquatic prey. In such a patchwork, natural selection could act with precision. Traits that conferred even a small advantage were honed across generations. Pollination, too, began to shift. While flowering plants had not yet evolved, conifers and cycads depended on wind and, increasingly, on insects. Primitive beetles, feeding on pollen, began to form relationships not yet symbiotic, but edging toward codependence. These were the earliest steps toward the evolutionary collaborations that would later define entire ecosystems. And as the undergrowth thickened, predator-prey dynamics evolved in response. Eyes migrated to better positions, jaws became more specialized, leg muscles adapted for bursts of energy. The forests demanded agility. They rewarded alertness. In the sediments left behind, we find the stories written in compressed layers: pollen grains, leaf impressions, petrified stumps, scattered bones. All of them speak to a world coming back into fullness. A world where the weight of extinction was finally beginning to lift. But it is important to remember that this forested fringe, lush though it seems, was never truly safe. It bordered chaos. One step too far inland led to desiccation. One unlucky generation could vanish in drought or fire. The plants and animals that flourished here did so not in isolation, but in tension with the forces that still haunted the earth. And yet, in this narrow band of shade and shelter, the seeds of future empires were planted. What happened then, when the forests met the sea? The forest edge whispered with life, but just beyond the margins stretched a world even older, even deeper, the open sea. It shimmered under Triassic suns, vast and unbroken. Yet for all its size, the ocean could only watch as the supercontinent's heart withered in heat. Pangea was too massive, its interior too distant. These waters, rich with mystery, lapped at shores they could not reach. To understand this paradox, we must begin with the shape of the world. Pangea, the singular landmass, was surrounded almost entirely by the global ocean called Panthalassa. It was unimaginably immense. One side of the Earth, nearly half the globe, was dominated by this single, massive body of salt water. On its western flank, a smaller but still critical sea nestled against the edges of Pangea, the Tethys Sea. This shallow tropical basin, fed by continental runoff and equatorial warmth, offered a different marine character, one closer to our modern image of sunlit reefs and teeming coastal zones. Yet despite their scale and diversity, these waters could not deeply touch the center of the continent. The distance from shore to core stretched thousands of kilometers. Without mountain corridors or deep river systems to channel moisture inward, oceanic influence faded quickly. Wind carried some salt and vapor, but it was not enough to break the grip of the interior heat. In today's world, oceans are climate engines. They store heat, they distribute it, they guide jet streams and monsoons. But during the time of Pangea, that engine was off balance. With one giant continent blocking the movement of air and water, ocean currents formed strange, sluggish loops. Instead of flowing freely between hemispheres, many currents simply circled in isolation. Equatorial waters pooled and overheated. Polar regions, lacking modern ice caps, cycled more slowly. Stratification increased. Deep water stayed deep. Shallow water baked under a red sky. The Panthalassic currents were powerful, but distant. Only the narrow continental shelves along Pangea's edge truly felt their touch. Upwelling brought nutrients from below, feeding plankton blooms and coastal fish, but none of this reached the desert plateaus that dominated the interior. Even the Tethys Sea, with its warm tides and shallow depths, could only moisten the eastern coasts. Inland, the land remained untouched. This separation shaped the biosphere in profound ways. Where ocean met land, life was abundant. Marine reptiles hunted in calm bays. Fish schooled in coral-like sponge reefs. Mollusks burrowed through silt. But where the waves ended, desolation often began. The boundary between life and lifelessness was drawn not by elevation, but by proximity to the ocean's breath. And beneath those ancient waters, far from the sun, life took on even stranger forms. In the depths of Panthalassa, where light could not reach and pressure climbed endlessly, early marine ecosystems found refuge. It was a different world, one shaped less by plants and sunlight than by chemosynthesis and the slow churn of planetary geology. Near hydrothermal vents, where magma met the seafloor, microbial communities thrived in chemical-rich plumes. These bacteria, fueled by sulfur compounds, formed the foundation of deep-sea food chains. Primitive tubeworms, blind crustaceans, and strange jelly-bodied predators circled slowly in these blackened realms. Their bodies bore little resemblance to surface life. In their DNA, however, were the threads of resilience that stretched back through Earth's darkest chapters. Closer to shore, reefs began a hesitant return. Though coral had vanished during the Permian extinction, new structures formed from sponges, algae, and microbial mats. These proto-reefs were smaller, flatter, and less architecturally complex, but they served the same role. They slowed waves, they sheltered fry, they trapped sediment, and slowly, they made space for diversity to return. Ammonoids, spiral-shelled cephalopods related to modern squids, were among the great survivors of this marine renaissance. Their fossils now span every continent, proof of their wide dispersal. Some species grew large, others stayed small and fast. Their success was tied to their versatility. They could rise and sink with ease. They could hunt in schools. They could adapt. Nothosaurs and placodonts, among the earliest marine reptiles, also began to appear. The former were sleek, long-necked hunters. The latter resembled armored sea turtles, crushing shellfish with wide, flat teeth. Their presence in shallow waters near the Tethys indicates that evolution was once again exploring the interface between land and sea. The Tethys Sea, with its warmth and gentler tides, became a nursery for these innovations. Shallow lagoons supported seagrass beds. Estuaries filtered sediment and cooled the coastal air. These zones were rich, but they were narrow. Just beyond the continental shelf, the ocean dropped into dark depths. The safety of the coast gave way to the uncertainty of the open sea. Despite these coastal boons, Pangea remained largely impervious to their effects. The heat baked on. The heartland stayed dry. Occasionally, storms would push moisture farther inland, but the relief was temporary. No true oceanic moderation could reach that far. The contrast between land and sea became one of the great drivers of evolutionary pressure. Coastal species could specialize, they could branch out, but inland species had to endure. Their adaptations leaned toward generalism, toughness, and mobility. It would not be until the eventual breakup of Pangea that ocean breezes would once again find paths into the heart of continents. But even at the edges, where salt met sand, a new kind of rhythm was emerging. Tides rose and fell, pulled by the moon, unchanged across eons. With them came patterns, feeding cycles, breeding cues, migrations. The sea, although distant from the interior, imposed order on the places it could reach, and in these rhythms, life began to harmonize. Harmony, however, did not mean stability. The seas that surrounded Pangea, though life-giving at the edges, remained volatile. Storms, unchecked by continental divides, could span hundreds of kilometers. Hurricanes swirled across the Tethys, flooding low-lying forests and dragging marine creatures far inland. These sudden intrusions sometimes brought nutrients to dry regions. They also deposited marine fossils well above the tideline, evidence we still find embedded in cliff faces and desert rock. On a larger scale, Panthalas's vastness created feedback loops in Earth's climate. Heat stored in its surface layers could delay cooling. When volcanic events warmed the atmosphere, the ocean absorbed the excess, but it could just as easily release it later, triggering sudden warming events. This buffering system, uneven and delayed, contributed to Earth's erratic climate during the Triassic. And while the ocean's surface danced with wind and wave, the deep sea was changing more slowly. Oxygen levels remained low. Many basins remained anoxic. The vertical mixing that today stirs our oceans and feeds surface productivity was weak. Without strong thermohaline circulation, nutrients stayed trapped below. It took time, millions of years, for this balance to restore. Even so, the marine biosphere was ahead of the land. Recovery in the oceans outpaced that on Pangea's surface. Diversity rose. Ecosystem complexity increased. Food webs stabilized. The great experiment of marine life was underway. Ichthyosaurs, dolphin-like reptiles with streamlined bodies, soon followed their earlier cousins into deeper waters. They hunted ammonoids and fish with speed and precision. Fossils show that some were viviparous, giving birth to live young, a trait rare among reptiles, but advantageous in open water. Even plankton, invisible to the naked eye, evolved rapidly. Radiolarians and foraminifera, encased in intricate shells, floated in vast blooms. Their remains would one day form chalk and limestone. For now, they served as floating meadows for larval fish and filter feeders. Yet none of this could alter the fundamental geography of the world. Pangea remained a fortress not just of land, but of isolation. Its vastness defined its destiny. The oceans could roar along its edges, but they could not infiltrate its heart. This reality shaped more than climate. It shaped perspective. The animals that lived in the forests, deserts, and rivers of Pangea would never know the abundance of the reef. They would never feel the constancy of the tide. Their world was one of contrast, harsh, beautiful, and self-contained. And so the story splits. The ocean's pulse and the land's silence evolve in parallel. Separate rhythms, separate experiments, one buoyed by waves and currents, the other burdened by stillness and drought. But even the land, so distant from the sea, would one day feel its pull. Something beneath the crust was stirring. The plates of the earth, long held in union, were beginning to strain. Tension built slowly, silently, in the deep places. How long could Pangea remain whole? The strain beneath the crust pressed upward in silence, but on the surface, life was already moving. The stillness of Pangea's interior was beginning to stir with footsteps. Not the lumbering gait of giants, not yet, but the persistent advance of scaled and clawed forms. Reptiles, shaped by fire and famine, were rising to take the crown. Across the broad and fractured ecosystems of the Triassic, these creatures did not arrive all at once. They emerged in waves, spreading through niches newly carved by extinction. The synapsids, remnants of an earlier age, lingered in the southern regions of Pangea. These were the distant ancestors of mammals. They bore fur or scales, depending on species. Some walked upright. Others crawled. Their teeth were already specialized incisors, molars, canines. Their jaws worked with more complexity than their cold-blooded peers. In the region that would become South Africa, species like Cynognathus prowled riverbanks. With powerful legs, a stocky body, and a head shaped like a bulldog's, it hunted small prey in shallow burrows and muddy reeds. It likely had whiskers, possibly even a warm-blooded metabolism. In a different world, it might have ruled. But further north, the archosaurs were beginning to assert themselves. These reptiles were leaner, lighter, and more efficient in their movement. Their hips allowed for a more upright gait. Their limbs moved beneath their bodies rather than splayed to the side. It was a subtle shift in posture, but it made all the difference. They ran faster. They balanced better. They breathed more efficiently. Evolution was preparing them for something big. On the open plains of central Pangea, where shade was rare and prey even rarer, speed and stamina were invaluable. Euparkeria, An early archosauriform raced across the baked soil on slender limbs. It was not large, barely a meter in length, but it was agile. Fossil evidence suggests it could rear up on two legs for short bursts, possibly to grab food, possibly to sprint. Its kind marked a new style of locomotion, one that would shape the future of terrestrial life. The plains were not rich, but they were vast. Space, not abundance, defined this ecosystem, and the reptiles made use of it. Their eggs, tough and leathery, were better suited to arid climates than those of amphibians. Their skin, scaled and dry, lost less moisture. Their metabolisms required less energy. These were creatures of endurance, not indulgence. The world had taught them to wait, to wander, and to take when the moment arrived. From shaded margins to exposed highlands, reptilian forms diversified. Some remained small, others bulked up. None yet reached the grandeur of the giants to come. But the architecture was in place, the bones, the muscles, the strategies. Reptiles were no longer just survivors. They were becoming rulers. Their reign, though still in its early chapters, was built not on dominance, but on versatility. Reptiles filled every available space, from coastal mangroves to high desert canyons. Each region brought its own challenges. Each demanded a different solution. In the wetter lowlands of what would one day be Europe, reptiles like pseudosutians, ancestors of modern crocodiles, patrolled river deltas and floodplains. These creatures were not yet aquatic specialists. Their limbs were long, and their snouts less flattened than their modern relatives. They hunted in ambush, teeth sharp and eyes patient. Unlike amphibians, they could venture far from water, yet they always returned. Their lives were written between droughts and floods. Elsewhere, in dry upland plateaus, smaller species of archosaur and synapsid shared the dust. Tracks, preserved in hardened mud, tell of tiny reptilian scavengers moving in groups. Trios, sometimes larger packs. These social behaviors coordinated movement. Communal nesting hinted at a depth of instinct more commonly attributed to birds or mammals. But they were here already, glinting in the eyes of ancient reptiles. The competition between synapsids and archosaurs intensified with every generation. For millions of years, the balance shifted back and forth. In some regions, the mammal-like reptiles held dominance, especially in southern territories with seasonal climates. Their adaptations to cooler temperatures, and possibly nocturnal habits, gave them an edge in certain cycles. But the archosaurs thrived in the heat. Their physiology, still debated by scientists today, may have allowed for partial endothermy, a halfway house between cold and warm-bloodedness. Enough to sustain bursts of activity, enough to chase, enough to flee, and where the sun hit hardest, they excelled. Over time, some archosaurs grew in stature, others shrank. Branches began to diverge. One would become the lineage that led to crocodiles. The other, still small, still experimental, would one day walk upright as dinosaurs. But that moment had not yet come. In the Triassic, they remained cousins still competing, still evolving, still sharing the same rugged stage. The fossil beds of Argentina reveal a tapestry of these early forms. Layered sandstone holds the impressions of countless reptiles, some larger than dogs, others no bigger than lizards. The diversity was startling, a sign that nature, freed from the constraints of the Permian, had once again begun to explore what life could be. Atop this spreading web of reptiles sat no clear apex predator. It was not yet the age of the tyrants. Instead, the food web pulsed with ambiguity. The strongest killers were rarely the largest. The best survivors were not the fastest. This was still a world in flux, and in flux, creativity thrives. All across Pangea, the age of reptiles was not marked by one species. It was marked by movement. That movement came in waves not just across the land, but through the generations. As climates shifted and regions dried or flooded, populations followed. Reptiles migrated. They nested, fed, and travelled with the rhythms of a world still stabilizing after catastrophe. The openness of Pangea, with its lack of high mountains or deep oceans between regions, allowed this spread. Species could range across vast distances. Genetic variation increased. local adaptations emerged. What began as a single clade could fracture into dozens, each tuned to its particular corner of the continent. Among these, some would rise quickly and vanish. Others would persist. One such group, the rhynchosaurs, began to dominate herbivore roles. Stocky, beaked, and wide-hipped, they scraped low vegetation with strong jaws and dug at roots with stubby limbs. Their fossils, like those of Lystrosaurus before them, are found across multiple continents, and like Lystrosaurus, they likely bred rapidly and grew fast. It was a strategy that worked until it didn't. Predators, too, kept pace. The Rawasuchians, towering archosaurs with deep jaws and long limbs, hunted in the late Triassic forests. Some reached lengths of 7 meters. Unlike the later theropod dinosaurs, their gait was more sprawling. But they were fearsome. Their teeth left grooves in bone. Their presence cleared space. Nothing that could run slower than them survived for long. And all the while, the dinosaurs waited in the wings. Small, upright, and unassuming, they had yet to rise. Their bones appear sporadically in the fossil record of this time. Eoraptor, Herrerasaurus. Slender creatures with hollow bones and sharp claws. They were not yet dominant, but they were present. It is easy, with hindsight, to see their eventual ascent as inevitable, but in the Triassic, they were just another experiment. Not yet kings, not yet icons, just one of many branches in a forest of change. The true ruler of the age was not a creature, but a concept adaptability. Reptiles inherited a world that had been shattered. They spread into its cracks. They filled its gaps. They survived where others could not, and in doing so, they reshaped the planet. Their footprints are still found in deserts and cliffs. Their bones lie under cities. Their teeth, worn with age, rest in museum drawers and locked cabinets. And their legacy, though fractured by time, is still unfolding in the lizards, turtles, and birds of our world. But at this point in their story, they were only beginning. The plains of Pangea stretched on, still warm with sunlight. The forests still whispered with wind, and beneath it all, deep in the crust, the tension continued to rise. Soon, something would break. The earth itself would split, and the reign of the reptiles, so tied to the land as it was, would face a new kind of challenge. What happens when the world they mastered begins to come undone? The world they had conquered was about to shift beneath them, but for some reptiles, the next frontier was not the land, it was the sky. As the Earth's crust strained in silence and the continents prepared to drift, evolution turned its gaze upward. And with that turn, a new kind of creature rose into the thermals, the first animals to truly master powered flight. The pterosaurs. Long before birds would flap their feathered wings, and long before bats would chase insects through the dark, these reptiles unfurled membranes of skin and bone. Their wings stretched from elongated fingers. Their hollow bones made them light. Their eyes, forward-facing and keen, locked on movement below. They did not descend from dinosaurs, as is sometimes believed. They were cousins, a separate branch of the archosaur lineage. Where dinosaurs turned their hips to the ground, pterosaurs reached for the wind. The setting could not have been more fitting. The wide-open plains of Pangea, baked by sun and wind, created enormous stretches of uninterrupted space. With few trees and fewer mountains in the interior, the sky itself became an open highway. Warm air rose from the scorched earth during the day, creating thermals, invisible spirals of rising air that could carry a gliding body for miles. For early flyers, these updrafts were lifelines. It is in this environment that we find the earliest known pterosaurs, such as Eudimorphodon. With sharp teeth and a wingspan of just over a meter, it hunted fish near coastal lagoons. But even in this relatively small form, it showed the essential features of the lineage: lightweight skeleton, flexible neck, a brain adapted for rapid processing of spatial movement. The sky was no longer empty. These creatures were not gliders in the passive sense. They could launch, they could steer, and they could land with precision. Evidence from fossilized bone shows strong muscle attachments, suggesting active flapping. This was not borrowed flight, it was earned. And as the Triassic period progressed, their diversity exploded. Some soared with elegance, others darted with speed. The skies of late Triassic Pangea became a testing ground for aerial design. The variety among pterosaurs grew swiftly. Some were short-snouted and insectivorous. Others developed long jaws lined with needle-like teeth, perfect for fishing. Their wings varied in shape and size, hinting at different flight styles. Broad wings allowed for soaring. Narrower ones lent themselves to maneuvering between cliffs or diving toward prey. In the fossil beds of what is now Italy and Austria, paleontologists have uncovered Preondactylus, a small pterosaur with long hind limbs and a slender tail. Its build suggests that early flyers were also proficient on the ground. They likely walked on all fours, using their wing fingers as support, much like modern bats resting on cave walls. This posture gave them versatility. They could forage, hunt, and flee without needing to stay airborne. The skies were not crowded yet. Pterosaurs had little competition in the air. Insects were abundant, but nothing else matched them in size or maneuverability. Birds had not evolved. There were no bats. The entire aerial niche was open, and with few predators capable of chasing them from the ground, the evolutionary incentive to take to the air only strengthened. But flight came at a cost. Bones had to become lighter. That made them fragile. Eyes had to be large and sensitive to light. That made them vulnerable to blinding flashes and darkness. Energetic demands were high. Constant flying consumed calories at a punishing rate. These animals needed access to food, and they needed it often. They were prisoners of their own freedom. To adapt, some developed pycno fibers, thin, hair-like filaments covering parts of their bodies. These may have helped retain heat, suggesting at least partial warm-bloodedness. The more efficient they became at regulating temperature, the wider their range. And, in Pangea's unpredictable climates, that range meant survival. Along coastlines, they thrived. Inland, they pushed boundaries. Fossils from what is now Greenland and China suggest pterosaurs reached across latitudes, adapting to cooler and more variable environments. They were no longer bound to tropical edges. They could go where others could not. They could follow rivers upstream. They could shadow herds of reptiles below. They could escape droughts by gliding hundreds of kilometers in search of lakes and wetlands. The world, cracked and sun-drenched as it was, had opened its airways, and the pterosaurs had claimed them. In doing so, they redefined the vertical space of ecosystems. Reptiles no longer ruled only from the ground. Now, there were eyes above. Those eyes changed the rules. Once flight entered the evolutionary equation, everything else had to adjust. Prey had to look up. Competition had to look out. Ecosystems, still recovering from extinction, began to layer themselves ground, canopy, sky. In the evenings, pterosaurs could be seen gliding along the edges of wetlands, catching the last thermals of the day. Some likely returned to cliffside nests, sheltered from predators by altitude alone. Others may have slept hanging from branches or nestled into rock crevices, folding their wings close. Their nesting behavior is still poorly understood, but evidence from later species shows they laid eggs with soft, leathery shells. These were likely buried or hidden beneath vegetation, like those of some modern reptiles. Vulnerable, dependent on heat from the earth or the sunday. In that vulnerability, a new type of strategy evolved. Smaller size, faster maturity, frequent reproduction, traits that could keep a lineage alive in a dangerous world. And the world of Pangea remained dangerous. Earthquakes, floods, volcanism, climate swings. Pterosaurs had to move fast, breed often, and spread wide. And they did. Their fossils now appear across every modern continent, from the deserts of Mongolia to the limestone cliffs of Brazil, from Arctic islands to the heartlands of Africa. Always fragile, often incomplete, but present. Their bones, light as twigs and twice as brittle, have survived over 200 million years, a whisper of a past sky written in stone. By the end of the Triassic, some pterosaurs had already begun to reach staggering sizes. One lineage, later to include Quetzalcoatlus, would eventually span the width of a small plain. But even in these early stages, the blueprint was clear. The sky could be more than a place to escape. It could be a place to dominate. And dominance meant vision. Literally, their eyes evolved with keen depth perception. Their brains developed specialized regions for flight control and spatial awareness. They were not only surviving, they were thriving. Where the land was cracked and dry, the sky still offered opportunity. In the wind and the heat, these early aviators carved invisible paths above the earth. Paths no predator could chase. Paths no prey could hide from. They became scouts, hunters, messengers of change. The sky was no longer empty. It carried life. And as the land beneath them began to tremble with tectonic tension, as cracks whispered across the crust and continents prepared to break, the pterosaurs flew on, above fault lines, across shallow seas. Beyond the reach of shifting plates, they would outlive the Triassic. They would witness the dawn of dinosaurs. They would spread with the world itself as it shattered into fragments. But for now, they remained in the wind. Shadows above sun-baked stone, eyes watching a world that still did not understand what flight had changed. The next chapter of life was already being written, and it was being written in the sky. They moved forward in silence, leaving impressions behind them. Shallow dents pressed into the soft mud of a floodplain. Each step a story, each stride a whisper. The prints would not last long in the living world. Wind, rain, and time would claim them quickly. But some endured, covered in silt, locked beneath sediment, pressed by centuries into stone, a message sealed within the crust, waiting. What they left behind were not just tracks. They were testimonies, proof that long before the continents drifted apart, long before oceans carved the world into islands and coasts, there were creatures walking paths that stretched across what is now 3 continents, a trail of toes and heels pressed across a unified earth. In what is now eastern North America, in the red sandstones of the Connecticut River Valley, paleontologists uncovered a sequence of 3-toed footprints, each one spaced evenly, each one showing the splay of claws and the depth of weight. They named the trackmaker Gralator, a name for a ghost. No bones, no skeleton, only the prints. But what prints they were! Similar tracks have been found in Germany, and again in Morocco. Identical in scale and pattern, the same 3 toes, the same stride length, the same ancient silence embedded in the rock. They were likely made by small, bipedal theropods, lightweight predators, perhaps a meter tall, scanning the plains with sharp eyes. They were not giants, but they were fast, and they were everywhere. Their movements suggest behavior, not just direction. Some tracks curve, others intersect. Some seem to stop suddenly, as if the animal paused, maybe to sniff the air, maybe to listen. One set ends at a sharp indentation, followed by nothing. Had it leapt? Had it been swept away? The tracks fall quiet, and we are left to guess. But what's most remarkable is not where the tracks end. It is where they begin again. On another continent, in another slab of stone, with the same pattern and pace. Across thousands of miles and millions of years, the footprint of one world remains. The Triassic and early Jurassic landscapes these creatures roamed were unlike the ones we know. Rivers did not obey the same boundaries. Mountains had not yet risen in their current places. The Atlantic Ocean did not yet exist. There was only Pangea, and it was still whole, which means the animals that made those prints could walk from what is now North America to what is now Europe without ever crossing a sea. This is more than a coincidence of rocks. It is a map, a cartography etched in footprints, a way of tracing ancient life, not through bones but through motion. In Africa's Atlas Mountains, trackways mirror those found in Connecticut and Germany. Paleontologists studying the site note the same depth of stride, the same angle of claw drag. The sandstone layers match as well. These were floodplains, wet in some seasons, dry in others, perfect for catching a footprint in soft mud, perfect for sealing it under layers of sand and silt when the river changed course. Even more compelling is the sequence. In all 3 sites, the trackways show groupings, not herds, These were not pack hunters, but there is suggestion of parallel movement. Multiple individuals following the same path, spaced apart by consistent distances. If these were indeed early theropods, it might indicate a loose social structure, not quite cooperative, not quite solitary, something in between. Perhaps they were following prey, or a receding shoreline. Perhaps they were simply following each other, drawn by familiarity in an unfamiliar world. The behavior is gone, but the motion remains, and with it, the land itself speaks. When geologists place these trackways on a reconstructed map of Pangea, the alignments are startling. They match not just in age and form, but in trajectory. Paths that now seem to leap across oceans once traced an unbroken corridor of terrain. Fossils that today lie in different countries once belonged to the same valley, the same migratory route, the same ancient journey. This connection does not rely on imagination. It is supported by paleomagnetism, by fossil pollen, by the grain of the sediment itself. Everything points to unity. A single expanse of earth. A single footprint repeated in time and space. A single story told in stone. And yet, no two tracks are exactly alike. In each track, we see individuality. One claw drags slightly. Another step is deeper on the right side. A third shows signs of slipping on a slope. These are not machine prints. They are the physical echoes of living beings. Muscle, weight, choice. Each footfall a decision. Each pause a breath. We do not know their names. We do not know their colours. We do not know if they sang or hissed or stayed silent. But we know where they stepped. And from that knowledge, we can build something larger. Consider a theropod walking through the early morning mist of what is now France. The air is warm. The soil is damp. Every step leaves a mark. It walks cautiously, perhaps sensing movement in the underbrush. Its toes grip the mud. It pauses. It moves again. Now imagine the same steps, but millions of years later, in what is now Nova Scotia. Another individual, or perhaps a descendant species, traces the same rhythm, same stride, same angle of contact. The continents have not yet shifted. The world is still holding together, and the paths are still shared. These are not merely tracks. They are lines across the parchment of time, and like any written line, they carry meaning. They teach us not just about animals, but about Earth itself, about how movement becomes memory, about how stone can hold breath, about how distance can be overcome not by machines, but by the sheer continuity of walking. There is poetry in that, and there is mystery. Some tracks head toward water, others veer into what was likely forest. A few vanish entirely, the layers above lost to erosion or buried too deep to reach. We will never find all of them, but the ones we have are enough. They tell us that life persisted, that movement continued, that long before borders and nations, long before language or thought or even mammals, there were footsteps, soft, deliberate, now fossilized. They crossed forever, and the earth remembered. Even the stone could remember water. Beneath the baked skin of what is now the Sahara Desert, beneath the ochres and dusts of a world turned dry, lie the silent remains of something ancient. Not the bones of beasts, but the veins of earth itself. Fossilized aquifers, subterranean rivers, the ghost patterns of inland seas long evaporated. What we see today is sand. What existed before was sustenance. In the late Triassic, Pangea's interior was a land of extremes. Days scorched, nights froze, rain fell infrequently, and when it did, it vanished quickly into the ground. Yet despite this brutality, life found footholds. Not everywhere, and not easily, but it persisted. And it did so by tracing the invisible threads of water that ran beneath the surface. Geological scans of modern North Africa have revealed the remains of vast aquifer systems. The Nubian sandstone aquifer system, stretching beneath parts of Chad, Sudan, Libya, and Egypt, is one of the largest and oldest known. Its origins lie deep in time, predating even the separation of the continents. These weren't formed during our era, or even during the Ice Ages. They were carved and filled when Pangea still breathed as one. Sediment cores from these aquifers carry a signature isotopes that tell us the water fell as rain between 20 and 100 million years ago, yet their paths, their boundaries, suggest origins older still. Water moving underground, pools locked between rock layers, caverns filled and sealed, a forgotten underworld of hydration in an age defined by thirst. These ancient systems were not only geological phenomena, they were biological lifelines. In some places, the underground water emerged, not in fountains or rivers as we know them, but in oases and seepages. Cracks in the rock allowed moisture to reach the surface. Shallow lakes formed during brief, humid phases. Algae bloomed, microbes spread. Amphibians laid eggs in fleeting puddles. And in rare, more stable pockets, ecosystems took root. Fossil records from regions that are now hyper-arid give glimpses of these water-fed sanctuaries. In the Taudeni Basin, buried beneath layers of Saharan sand, sedimentary deposits show ripple marks and mud cracks, signs of lakes that expanded and shrank. Stromatolite structures, layered by cyanobacteria, offer evidence of life drawn to shallow, still water. And in deeper layers still, there are fossils of fish, not coastal species, not oceanic migrants, but freshwater dwellers. This tells us something profound. That inland seas once pulsed across the heart of Pangea, not vast open bodies like Panthalassa or Tethys, but broad, slow-moving basins. Some may have connected seasonally to rivers, others were cut off entirely, fed only by rainfall or underground seepage. Over time, they dried, they hardened, they vanished, but not without leaving a mark. Salt flats today, like those in Algeria or Mauritania, can be traced back to these ancient lakes. Their mineral patterns mirror the chemistry of long-evaporated waters. Gypsum, halite. These are not desert products. They are evaporation's residue, the footprints of vanished lakes. And it was in these places, at the margins of drought, that life made some of its boldest adaptations. Reptiles, already dominant in form and number, learned to survive with less. Their eggs resisted desiccation, their skins limited water loss. Their movements slowed during the day, becoming crepuscular, conserving energy when the sun was most violent. Those near aquifers thrived. Those who wandered too far vanished. Plants, too, changed. Root systems deepened, leaves thickened. Some developed waxy coatings, while others evolved to fold during the hottest hours. In protected pockets, seed ferns still clung to life. But the real victors were the early gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, ginkgos. Their cones protected seeds during drought. Their needles limited moisture loss, and their seeds could wait years, even decades, for the return of rain. In Pangea's driest heart, the key to survival was invisibility, not just of movement or colour, but of infrastructure. The real action was below, beneath the feet, beneath the sand, beneath the strata. Modern scans, using remote sensing and gravity mapping, have traced buried riverbeds across the Sahara and other ancient desert regions. These paleochannels wind like scars. Some are hundreds of kilometers long. Some connect to extinct lake basins. Others disappear into subsurface voids. During Pangea's wetter periods, these channels flowed. During dry phases, they remained dormant, waiting. Fossils clustered along these channels suggest that animals tracked them, possibly sensing moisture or following vegetated corridors. Crocodilian remains have been found in layers far from current coasts. Turtles, freshwater mollusks. The presence of these creatures confirms that, at least temporarily, these rivers were alive. So while the surface told one story of dust, heat, and absence, the underground whispered another. Even today, deserts hold this secret. Beneath dunes that stretch for miles are chambers of ancient rain, reservoirs that took millennia to fill and now sit entombed. Some still feed wells. Others have been tapped for agriculture. A few are vanishing as quickly as they're found. But the idea remains that under every great desert might lie the memory of a sea. In Pangea, these buried waters helped stabilize the biosphere. They prevented total collapse during arid intervals. They offered temporary reprieve to migrating species, and they helped create the environmental pressure that pushed evolution forward. Imagine a dinosaur herd crossing a dry plain. No visible water, no shelter. But in the night, cooler air condenses above a crack in the rock. Moisture gathers, a trickle forms. A hidden stream gurgles underground, just meters below. The herd moves on, never touching it. But plant roots find it. Microbes flourish in the shadow of stone. Life, silent and unseen, persists. This hidden resilience shaped entire lineages. Those who adapted to feast and famine, who could traverse both drought and deluge, were favored. Species that relied solely on surface abundance disappeared. Those who could find nourishment in scarcity thrived. And so, beneath the sun-cracked face of early Pangea, beneath the feet of reptilian giants and tiny burrowing insects alike, a secret world hummed. Not loud, not visible, but essential. A world of hidden waters. And while most traces of it have faded, stone remembers. Beneath the dunes, beneath the rock, beneath time, Earth still holds the echo. It did not start with a roar, but with a whisper. No fracture split the sky. No mountain fell. Beneath the stable, sleeping skin of Pangea, something ancient stirred. Far below the crust, in the shifting mantle, heat pooled. These upwellings were not chaotic, they were focused. Narrow streams of molten rock pushed upward, buoyed by forces older than the continents themselves. These were mantle plumes, columns of searing material rising from deep within Earth, slowly pressing against the lithosphere like a breath against glass. For millions of years, Pangea had held firm. Locked together, its plates resisted movement, bound by the momentum of ancient collisions. But nothing on Earth holds still forever. The heat gathering beneath the supercontinent was patient. It did not rush. It built pressure in silence. Then, the surface began to respond. Long before the continents drifted apart, before coastlines formed or seas widened, subtle clues emerged. The crust began to thin in places. Not collapse. Not yet. But stretch. Tension formed invisible seams. These became rift zones, long, shallow valleys where the surface began to pull apart. It was tectonic breathwork, slow and rhythmic. Cracks opened where none had existed. The interior of Pangea, once thought inert, began to show signs of unrest. In regions that would become present-day eastern North America and northwestern Africa, the earliest signs of rifting can still be read in the rocks. Long, linear basins, filled with volcanic material and sediment, marked the places where the Earth had started to pull at itself. And it was here, amid these quiet beginnings, that the story of Pangea's end truly began. The rise of mantle plumes did more than stretch the crust. It awakened fire. As pressure increased, material from deep within Earth melted. It surged upward, not explosively, but persistently. In weak zones of the lithosphere, this heat formed large igneous provinces, vast regions of volcanic rock that spread across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. These were not the eruptions we know today. They were floods of basalt, oozing and layering, transforming landscapes and altering climates. One of the most significant of these was the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP. It sprawled across what would later become the margins of North America, South America, Africa, and parts of Europe. Its birth was slow. It pulsed over millions of years. But its fingerprints are clear. The rocks tell us it was one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history. Massive outpourings of lava-blanketed land, ash-choked skies, gases filled the atmosphere. It is likely that this volcanic activity contributed to another mass extinction, the one that marked the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic periods. But more importantly, it marked the opening act of a continental divide. Where the plume pushed hardest, rifts widened, valleys deepened. The crust fractured more completely. This was not a sudden break. No single day saw the split. But year by year, grain by grain, the seams became visible. From above, nothing changed. Forests still grew, rivers still ran, Dinosaurs still walked, unaware that the ground beneath them was slowly being rearranged. What began as invisible heat was becoming geography. As the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic, the rift valleys lengthened. They formed stair-step landscapes, bordered by faults. Some were dry, others filled with water, creating long, narrow lakes. These lakes, trapped within rifting zones, became havens for life and for preservation. Sediments gathered at their bottoms, layer by layer, recording each passing season. It is from these sediments that we learn much of what happened. Fossils found within them include early fish, amphibians, and even dinosaur footprints. These lakes were not just the byproduct of tectonic stress. They were memory machines. They recorded a changing planet in ink made of mud and time. Meanwhile, the mantle plumes continued to rise. In places, they formed domes, bulges in the crust created by the pressure from below. These domes served as prelude. As they lifted the land, gravity pulled outward on their flanks. The domes eventually cracked, feeding the rift systems further. This process, though geological, was almost organic. Earth lifted and tore like overripe fruit. What had once been Pangea's strength, its unified bulk, now became its vulnerability. The immense size of the supercontinent acted like insulation. Heat could not escape easily. The interior grew hotter and more unstable. The planet itself required release. And so, fault lines deepened, seams widened. The continents that had once been fused as one began to shift, ever so slightly, in opposing directions. From this slow separation came everything. Oceans would rush in to fill the gaps. Ecosystems would divide and evolve in isolation. Species that once shared a continent would never meet again. But all of that was still to come. For now, Pangea cracked. Quietly, relentlessly, from beneath. Cracks widened underfoot, though they remained unseen. The land gave no warning but held the tension of something about to break. As Pangea continued to pull itself apart, these fault lines matured into rift valleys, carving the early contours of a world yet to be born. In the regions we now call Eastern North America, Northwestern Africa, and parts of Western Europe, the ground began to stretch. With this tension, the crust thinned and fractured. The Earth's surface did not shatter in a single moment. It opened in a mosaic. Block by block, the land shifted. Some pieces dropped to form long depressions. These were the rift valleys low, linear scars in the supercontinent's skin. These valleys became basins. Into them flowed not just sediment and water, but fire. Beneath the crust, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or camp, was stirring. At first, it whispered in gases. Thin veins of basalt pushed upward through faults. Magma seeped into the rifting seams, forming sills and dikes. But the pressure did not stop. It mounted, building deep reservoirs of molten rock that pulsed with energy, waiting for release. And then, it came. Lava erupted across thousands of square kilometers, spilling into the rift valleys with terrifying volume. These were not towering fountains of flame. These were floods. Curtains of fire stretched across the horizon. The land glowed. Basalt spread in sheets, pooling in valleys, drowning whatever lived nearby. This was camp's first exhale, and Earth was changed forever. The scope of these eruptions is difficult to comprehend. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province was not a single event. It unfolded in pulses, each one spreading fire across continents. Over several million years, layer upon layer of basalt buried the land. When the lava cooled, it left behind dark, dense plains. But before the rock hardened, gases surged skyward. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane. These gases did not just darken the sky. They poisoned the air and warmed the planet. The greenhouse effect amplified, trapping heat in an already stressed atmosphere. The Earth, already reeling from tectonic instability, found itself choking on its own breath. Life suffered. Ecosystems at the margins of the rift zones began to collapse. In the oceans, acidification from volcanic gases disrupted the food chain. On land, temperature spikes and habitat loss silenced species that had survived earlier extinctions. This cascade of effects marked the end of the Triassic period and the beginning of the Jurassic. Another extinction event carved into time, one tied directly to Camp's wrath. The rift valleys did not remain empty. After the lava cooled, sediments resumed their slow accumulation. Rivers returned. Lakes filled the depressions once again. These basins captured fossils of fish, amphibians, and even reptiles that had learned to navigate the new terrain. Their bones lay between layers of black basalt and red shale, time trapped in stone. Meanwhile, Camp continued. Even as new forests tried to grow, another eruption would arrive, erasing them in a flood of fire. The planet breathed in magma, and it had not yet finished. With each fiery pulse, the supercontinent weakened. The crust, once stitched together in prehistoric unity, now bore the stress of constant expansion. The rift valleys grew deeper. Their edges cracked like the spine of a book pulled too far open. From beneath, magma threaded upward, tracing invisible seams with heat and pressure. Some of these fractures never fully separated. Others, like the nascent rift that would become the Atlantic Ocean, finally broke through. As the Central Atlantic magmatic province waned, its work had already set the stage for continental drift. Seafloor spreading began. Oceans infiltrated the gaps. Water followed fire. The legacy of Camp can still be seen today. From the cliffs of the Newark Basin in New Jersey to the rocky coasts of Morocco, its basalt layers stand as monuments to Earth's volcanic adolescence. These formations, identical in chemistry and structure, are found across continents that now sit oceans apart. They are signatures of a time when the world was one. The land may have fractured, but the rocks remember. The lava flows serve as geological handwriting, signing the final chapters of Pangea with molten ink. Geologists study these flows not only for their destructive power, but for the clues they hold. Each crystal within the basalt speaks of temperature, pressure, and the rhythm of ancient Earth. What began as soft rifting had become tectonic transformation. Pangea was no longer a solid whole. It was a shell thinning from within. It cracked, burned, and gave birth to valleys filled with fire, and soon it would begin to split for good. Separation did not come as a violent break, but as a rhythm. Earth moved in slow pulses, each one pushing continents just slightly farther apart. Beneath the fractured skin of Pangea, the cycle had begun. A geologic breath. Expansion and contraction written not in seconds but in eons. This cycle was not a theory when Pangea lived. It was the mechanism of Earth itself. Plate tectonics, now fundamental to our understanding of planetary motion, had already been at work for billions of years. Though not yet understood by any eyes to witness it, the continents rode atop immense slabs of lithosphere. These plates moved because the mantle beneath them churned. That churning was convection. Heat from the planet's core radiated upward. Hot material rose, cooler material sank, and this cycle stirred the interior like a pot over low flame. The result was motion, and the motion was relentless. The plates above were caught in this ancient tide. They collided. They buckled. They split. Pangea had formed through that same process. Multiple earlier supercontinents, Rodinia, Columbia, even Valbara, had existed before it. Each came together through subduction zones and continental collisions. Each later broke apart as mantle currents reversed or reorganized. Pangea was not Earth's first breath. It was just the latest exhale. Once unified, the supercontinent had trapped heat beneath its vast body. With so much land covering the surface, there were fewer escape routes for thermal energy. The result was pressure, and pressure, like breath held too long, demanded release. Tectonic activity beneath the crust responded. Rifts began to form, invisible at first, but widening over time. Mantle plumes, rising columns of heat from deep within the Earth, began to weaken the continental plate from below. These plumes, like the ones that had cracked earlier continents, pressed upward with persistent force. Geologists today can trace these plume scars. Large igneous provinces and flood basalts are silent testimonies to these deep forces. They reveal where heat built up, where it pushed, and where Earth began to break. In this way, Pangea was living on borrowed time. It was vast, but not invulnerable. It was powerful, but not permanent. The same forces that had stitched it together were preparing to undo it, one slow heartbeat at a time. What seems like stillness on the surface is only illusion. Below, the engine of the Earth never truly rests. And as the pressure rose, so too did the signs of change. The crust thinned. The cracks deepened. The first breath out had already begun. That release came not as a single event, but as a gradual cascade of ruptures and reforms. At the center of this transformation were spreading centers, places where the Earth's crust stretched, tore, and allowed molten rock to rise from the mantle below. In these zones, new crust was born. Basaltic lava cooled into solid rock, expanding the seafloor and pushing continental masses outward. At the heart of the transformation, the Central Atlantic Rift began to assert its presence. This was not yet an ocean, nor even a wide channel. It was a fracture line, a scar in the skin of Pangea, slowly growing. In the future, it would become the vast Atlantic Ocean, but during the earliest stages of separation, it was more whisper than roar. A promise of distance, a preview of division, but it was not alone. Across the surface of the supercontinent, similar rifts formed in regions that today we call East Africa, Antarctica, and the western margins of North America. Though not all would evolve into full-fledged oceans, each represented the stirring breath of the planet. They were expressions of inner tension. The Earth was flexing, stretching, and shifting. The motion of the plates was not arbitrary. They drifted atop the asthenosphere, a semi-fluid layer of hot rock, guided by convection currents. These slow, circular motions within the mantle dictated the direction of movement for each tectonic plate. Some collided, some diverged, others slid past one another. Over time, they rearranged the face of the world like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle with no fixed borders. Earth's crust is not static. It is constantly being recycled. Old crust subducts beneath younger crust at trenches, melting back into the mantle. New crust emerges at ridges. This cycle of renewal drives the rhythmic expansion and contraction of continents, the supercontinent cycle. The formation and fragmentation of Pangea were only one iteration in this ongoing process. What is truly extraordinary is that this cycle repeats itself. After Pangea, new supercontinents are expected to form again. Models suggest a future landmass may eventually take shape in the Northern Hemisphere, drawing together the Americas, Asia, and parts of Australia. The process will take tens of millions of years, but if the planet remains geologically active, it will happen. This understanding, though modern, casts new light on the story of Pangea. It reveals that its formation was never an endpoint. It was a midpoint, a fleeting moment in Earth's long breath. First the gathering, then the stillness, then the release. And that release shaped more than the land. It redirected ocean currents, it shifted climate belts, it isolated ecosystems and carved new paths for evolution. A single planetary exhale scattered life across the globe, setting the stage for new chapters to unfold. Over the course of hundreds of millions of years, the shift became unstoppable. What began as subtle deformation accelerated into the wholesale remodeling of the planet's surface. The continents that once fit neatly into one another began to drift, some slowly, and others with surprising speed. Africa nudged northward. North America peeled away west. India surged toward Asia like a rogue ship in slow motion. Evidence of this grand motion is carved into the bedrock. Magnetic patterns preserved in cooled lava flows reveal how continents have rotated and migrated. The alternating bands of magnetic polarity on the ocean floor tell a story of continuous divergence, with Earth's magnetic field flipping as new crust formed along mid-ocean ridges. Like tree rings in basalt, these patterns show age, direction, and timing. Modern instruments have confirmed what ancient rocks began to whisper. Satellite GPS measurements now detect the movement of Earth's plates with precision down to the millimeter. We know that the Atlantic Ocean continues to widen while the Pacific contracts. These are not just relics of ancient forces. They are ongoing dynamics, still alive beneath our feet. The breakup of Pangea changed more than geography. It marked the onset of new biological isolations. As land masses drifted apart, species diverged. Unique evolutionary paths emerged on separated continents. Marsupials thrived in Australia. Large mammals spread through Eurasia. Dinosaurs diversified in isolated populations before their sudden extinction. Without the fragmentation of Pangea, the rich biodiversity we see today might never have emerged. What remains perhaps most remarkable is how inevitable it all was. Pangea's fate was sealed from the moment it formed. Its immense size meant that it would always act like a thermal lid, trapping geothermal heat and generating tectonic instability. Its very unity was its weakness. As with all previous supercontinents, it was destined to break, and in that breaking, it honored the deep rhythm of the Earth. The supercontinent cycle, often described as Earth's geologic respiration, governs the slow dance of land and sea. It is a pattern dictated not by randomness, but by the internal machinery of the planet, a balance of forces, heat and release, pressure and flow. Today, we live in the wake of that breath. The continents remain in motion, slowly setting the stage for the next reunion. Perhaps in 200 million years, a new supercontinent will form. Amarsia, Novo-Pangea, or Pangea Ultima, whatever name it takes, the principle remains the same. The Earth breathes not in moments, but in millennia. In every ripple of ocean floor, in every fault line and mountain chain, we find the quiet signature of that breath. Pangea's cracking was not the end of something. It was the continuation of everything. The aftermath of continental cracking was not confined to stone. As tectonic plates shifted in slow procession, the skies above responded. Climate zones, once held in relative stability by Pangea's vast and unified form, began to fracture just as the land below had done. The pattern of rainfall changed, storm belts shifted, and in the silence that followed, life itself began to diverge. It started subtly. Regions that had once basked under seasonal monsoons found those rains fading. Areas on the other side of emerging uplifts and ridges saw rainfall increase, reshaped by newly forming topographies. Even before the Atlantic Ocean truly widened, the continental rearrangement was already pulling at the threads of Earth's atmospheric circulation. In the age of early separation, monsoons ruled much of the global climate. With a supercontinent the size of Pangea, the heat difference between land and sea was vast. Summers scorched the land. Rising heat pulled moisture in from the ocean, triggering massive monsoonal storms. But as rift zones grew, and as land masses began to lean into separation, the distribution of heat changed. That change disrupted these patterns. The result was an invisible boundary. In places where rain once flowed predictably, drought crept in. Flora adapted or perished. Ancient gymnosperms gave way to more drought-resistant types in the interior. Meanwhile, at the outer edges, where rainfall remained steady or increased, forests thickened. Plant communities diverged, and with them, the animals they supported followed suit. Evolution listens closely to water. The presence or absence of rain determines the shape of ecosystems. It limits or expands the niches available to life. As the monsoons migrated, so did survival strategies. Species once part of a single biome began to split into isolated evolutionary paths. A creature in the north may have found its closest relatives cut off by nothing more than a drying plain or a redirected storm belt. Even the soil responded. In wetter zones, rich, loamy earth encouraged deep-rooted trees and expansive canopies. In drier regions, soils hardened, cracking under the heat. Life that once moved freely across the continent now faced barriers as real as mountains, made not of stone but of scarcity. A shift in rainfall had become a wall. This was no sudden catastrophe. It unfolded over millions of years, like a long whisper through time. But its effect was profound. Ecosystems, once part of a shared biological stage, were breaking into separate acts. The play of life on Earth had begun to write new chapters in parallel. Climate, like tectonics, is a force of division. Where the Earth's crust pushed continents apart, the changing sky redrew the boundaries of survival. The rains no longer fell as they once had. The world was still connected by land, but water had already begun to divide it. Even before oceans filled the rifts between drifting continents, the patterns of rain had carved ecological distance. In some regions, newly forming highlands disrupted airflow, casting long rain shadows. Moist air rising up the windward slopes dropped its burden, leaving the leeward side dry and desolate. Where lush forest once stretched unbroken, now deserts or grasslands emerged, fragmenting once unified ecosystems into enclaves of isolation. These geographic changes did not move species physically, but they constrained their movements. Amphibians, reliant on consistent moisture, could not cross parched expanses. Insects adapted to rainforest understory could not transition to sparse, sun-baked woodlands. Birds and small reptiles, once widespread, began to vanish from places their ancestors had long inhabited. Each patch of altered climate became a crucible for evolutionary pressure. In Africa's heartland, archosaurs evolved into increasingly distinct forms. Some became fleet-footed predators, adapted to the dry savannas expanding along the inland plains. Others, in wetter pockets near the coasts and highlands, evolved broader bodies and stronger limbs to navigate the dense underbrush and tangled vegetation. Their shared ancestry grew less apparent as climate drew invisible curtains between them. The process was mirrored across what is now South America, India, and even Antarctica. At the time, these land masses were still connected, their final separation not yet written in stone, but their skies had already turned foreign. Local monsoon systems, driven by budding seas and thermal contrasts, diverged. One region baked in prolonged dry seasons, another drowned beneath the pulse of annual deluges. Plants became unwitting chroniclers of the change. Fossilized spores, leaves, and pollen grains reveal the shift in vegetation across what would become continental divides. In some layers, drought-resistant conifers dominate. In others, ferns and cycads flourish, marking periods of wetter climate. Layer by layer, these botanical traces tell a story of landscapes cleaving apart not by rock, but by atmosphere. As ecosystems changed, so too did behaviors. Animals in increasingly arid regions adapted not only in form, but in habit. Burrowing became more common, as creatures sought to escape the harsh midday sunday. Some reptiles evolved more efficient water retention, their physiology adapting to life with less. Others developed new patterns of movement, migrating with the shifting rains or tracking ephemeral streams that blinked in and out of existence with the seasons. This was the beginning of evolutionary divergence on a continental scale, driven not by sudden extinction, but by prolonged, uneven transformation. Climate was the silent sculptor. It carved the world along lines unseen, etching valleys of separation in air and water long before oceans spilled into them. The continents would split later. The species were already doing so. Rain had become a boundary, a new kind of geography, one that shifted not only how life moved across the land, but how it would evolve in the ages to come. Across the supercontinent, skies turned into architects. Each shifting wind current, each monsoon drift, redrew the map of life. The heartbeat of Pangea's weather, once thundering in unison, now began to flutter in separate rhythms, and where rhythm changed, so did destiny. Over what would become North America, inland areas began to dry as the influence of oceanic moisture waned. Once forested regions faded into scrublands. Insects that had once pollinated vast cycads were replaced by species better suited to drier blooms. Reptiles that had roamed freely began to localize. Some vanished, others adapted. Still, others moved, slowly driven toward the coasts where humidity held out longer. Far to the south, in regions destined to form Gondwana, rainfall became more intense, but increasingly seasonal. Great floods surged through the flatlands during storm seasons, carving out new river paths. In between, long dry periods punished the unprepared. This feast or famine cycle favored new adaptations. Behemoth herbivores developed ways to store energy. Predators grew leaner, faster, more opportunistic. It was not just the amount of rain that changed, but the timing. Once steady climates now oscillated wildly. The rhythm of life, tied so intimately to the cadence of weather, had to find new tempos. Those who could not adapt to the new beat were left behind. Mountains formed along fault lines added to the chaos. As they rose, they intercepted clouds and redirected winds, creating localized climates within broader zones. Valleys could hold verdant oases, while just over the ridge, parched lands lay in silence. The resulting patchwork of microclimates became an engine of biodiversity, encouraging speciation even across short distances. The forests that once stretched unbroken along Pangea's coasts splintered. Where monsoons persisted, dense canopies returned. Where they faded, only scattered groves survived. Evolutionary lineages that once mingled now followed separate scripts. Over time, these scripts became too different to reconcile. Species that might once have interbred became strangers to one another. Not enemies, not allies, just foreign. In the fossil record, the clues accumulate. Skeletons with minor variations in bone length. Teeth adapted for different prey. Nostrils shifted for humid or dry breathing environments. These are the fingerprints of rain, the imprints of climate on anatomy, the invisible painter leaving visible strokes. Eventually, the continents would tear fully apart. The Atlantic would widen, the Tethys Sea would fade. But by then, the biologies of these lands had already drifted, not on rafts of rock, but on rivers of air. Long before the world broke in body, it broke in breath. The rain, ever gentle, ever relentless, had drawn the first true lines of division. Divided by the rains, life kept splintering. Yet not all boundaries came from wind or water. Some were born from the very bones of the land. Pangea, though still a single landmass, had begun to fragment from within. Valleys sank into silence. Plateaus rose into rare air. Basins, cut off by elevation or encircled by barren lands, became cages of time. Within them, evolution carved new stories. These enclosed worlds were not visible from the sky. To an early pterosaur riding a thermal high above the continent, Pangea may still have looked whole. But below, in the folds of its surface, were biological laboratories secluded, stable, and strange. Each was an experiment. Life inside responded to its own version of climate, terrain, and chance. Some of these regions formed in rift valleys. As tectonic forces stretched the crust, long depressions opened like slow-healing wounds. Water pooled in some, giving rise to freshwater lakes surrounded by sheltering walls of stone. Species here evolved in isolation. Fish in one basin bore different traits from those in the next, even if separated by no more than 100 kilometers of dry rock. Elsewhere, plateaus stood as islands above the floodplains. Their cooler air, thinner atmosphere, and distinct vegetation created selective pressures unknown below. Small mammals, perhaps ancestral synapsids, adapted to the chill with denser fur and lower metabolic rates. Reptiles, usually sun lovers, altered their basking patterns or crept toward nocturnal habits. The edges of these highlands were often sheer. Cliffs, rather than oceans, formed barriers more effective than distance. Once a population established on a plateau, it could remain untouched by outside influence for millennia. In this stillness, divergence flourished. Pockets of rainforest nestled between arid plains told similar stories. These green remnants of a wetter past harbored species that had disappeared elsewhere. Ferns that once blanketed vast tracts of Pangea now survived only in shaded hollows and mist-laced valleys. Insects in these enclaves mirrored those of ancient times. Their evolution slowed not by stagnation but by stable conditions. The same held true in caves and lava tubes. Beneath the surface, where light rarely touched, organisms evolved in total separation. Some lost pigment, others abandoned eyes entirely. Life here followed rules dictated by stone and dark, not by sun or storm. And while such habitats were small, they added to the growing mosaic of difference. Pangea had not yet broken. The great fissure was still to come. But inside its skin the world was already fracturing. Not with noise or drama, but with quiet separations, tiny gaps that life turned into gulfs. Over time, These micro-worlds grew more distinct, the pace of change, slow but steady, left behind a record, not in rock layers alone, but in the teeth, bones, and feathers of those who lived within them. What once were subtle adaptations became defining traits. Evolution did not need continents to split. It only needed time, pressure, and seclusion. In one basin, a group of archosaurs adapted to muddy lowlands. Their limbs grew stout, their bodies flattened for better balance on the slippery banks. Just a few hundred kilometers away, in a neighboring valley with firmer ground and thicker vegetation, their cousins evolved longer legs, sharper talons, and leaner builds. Both descended from a common stock, yet their paths had diverged beyond return. A similar pattern unfolded among plants. Conifers growing in nutrient-poor plateaus developed narrow, waxy needles to conserve moisture. In lower, fog-laced basins, broader leaves captured more diffuse light. These differences affected every creature in the ecosystem. Insects pollinated only certain flower shapes. Herbivores fed selectively. Predators followed prey into narrower ecological corridors. Some habitats became evolutionary cul-de-sacs. Isolated too long, species there could not compete if conditions changed. Others became cradles of innovation, birthing traits that would later define entire lineages. Feather-like filaments may have first evolved in such secluded zones, not for flight, but for insulation or display. In a closed basin where every visual cue mattered, the slightest edge meant survival. The role of volcanic activity in this isolation was profound. Repeated eruptions blanketed large areas in ash, creating natural fire breaks between forests. In the aftermath, regrowth was patchy. Plants colonized in bursts, and animal populations expanded unevenly. These chaotic resets acted like random dice rolls in evolution's hand. Depending on which species recolonized first, entirely different food webs could emerge in adjacent areas. Even the weather contributed to division. Storm cells, redirected by ridges or channeled through valleys, created microclimates within already enclosed regions. One slope might receive torrents of seasonal rain, while the next remained dry. Over generations, this led to parallel but diverging adaptations in everything from root systems to predator eyesight. Some creatures became trapped by their success. A predator highly specialized for the dense undergrowth of a secluded forest could not adapt if that forest vanished. Its bones, later fossilized in mud, would whisper a story of triumph and entrapment. Others proved more flexible. Generalist feeders and adaptable scavengers found footholds in multiple enclaves, becoming biological bridges between worlds. Yet, even these nomads faced limits. Geography may shift slowly, but isolation leaves deep marks. With each passing epoch, the shared biology of Pangea unraveled a little more, bound not by distance, but by distinctness. Within one world, countless others had emerged, all evolving toward futures that no longer overlapped. By the late Triassic, Pangea held a secret. Beneath its apparent unity, its biological fabric had become a patchwork of divergence. No longer did its life forms move and mingle freely across the vast terrain. Invisible walls, built from time and terrain, separated even those that once shared the same ancestors. The continent was a cradle of isolation. Evidence of this fragmentation lies not only in bone, but in absence. Fossil records show species blooming in one region, yet never appearing in another. The absence is telling. It means not just extinction, but a kind of exile. Once evolutionary threads diverged within these hidden worlds, they rarely met again. Geographic isolation sharpened behavior as much as body. Some predators in arid basins became stalkers, using camouflage and stillness to approach prey. In wetter, enclosed forests, their counterparts became ambush hunters, lunging from shadows. Over time, instincts hardened into ritual. Behaviors became encoded, no longer just learned but inherited. Social species followed this pattern too. Small proto-mammals in upland valleys developed communal burrowing behaviors, relying on warmth and group survival. Others, in dry flats, became solitary, territorial, fierce. These differences were invisible to the rocks, but written into nervous systems, and night calls. Pangea's climate continued to shift, adding another layer to the complexity. Winds changed course. Lakes dried or expanded. Some microhabitats disappeared altogether. Their unique species vanished with them, never having spread beyond their secluded zones. Others adapted and migrated, but when they did, they entered lands already claimed by other forms, equally adapted and equally alien. Isolation became legacy. The evolutionary experiments born in these lost worlds didn't always survive, but their innovations sometimes did. A specialized jaw, an efficient lung, a pattern of feathers or scales. Traits honed in solitude eventually spread not because of conquest, but because of extinction and opportunity. When one niche collapsed, another was waiting. These isolated crucibles became the silent authors of the future. As the land continued to tear, as rifts became seas and coasts pulled apart, the evolutionary lines drawn long before continental drift were already preparing for separate destinies. What began as microevolution in a plateau or basin would one day become macroevolution across the globe. To look at a world map today is to see the aftermath. The forms of life that dominate different continents owe as much to these ancient interior divisions as they do to the later oceans that would split the land. Pangea may have been a single supercontinent, but biologically, it had already become a constellation of isolated worlds. One world, fractured by its own heartbeat, life divided long before the land would follow. Life had already fractured into hidden pockets across basins and plateaus, but the land itself was preparing for a greater division. The cracks that had stretched quietly for millions of years were no longer content to remain dry valleys. They deepened, they widened, and for the first time since the birth of Pangea, the sea crept in. The Garden of Unity was no longer whole. Water was coming to claim its share. It began along what is now eastern North America and northwestern Africa. Rift valleys had carved long troughs into the supercontinent's skin. At first, they were filled with rivers and lakes, shallow basins collecting runoff from seasonal storms. Sediments piled in them year after year, creating red beds of sandstone that geologists still study today. These lakes teemed with fish, amphibians, and early reptiles, each leaving behind fossils that now serve as whispers of their existence. But the valleys kept sinking. The crust kept stretching. What was once a lake became a gulf. And eventually, salt water arrived. The first incursions were tentative. Narrow channels opened where rivers met low ground. Seawater seeped inland, brackish and unstable. Tides lapped against shores that had once been entirely terrestrial. The land did not flood overnight. It surrendered slowly, retreating grain by grain, until rift lakes gave way to shallow straits. For the animals watching from the shore, the difference may have seemed subtle at first. The water tasted different. The fish swimming within it changed. But geologically, the difference was profound. Saltwater meant permanence. Saltwater meant Pangea had been breached. The evidence of these events lies in the Newark supergroup of eastern North America, where thousands of meters of layered rock record the shift. Sandstones alternate with shales, and in between them, thick sheets of basalt mark episodes of volcanic outpouring. Ripple marks frozen in stone show the currents of shallow tidal flows. Fossilized fish appear where only freshwater species had lived before. These are not just rocks, they are testimonies of the moment the Atlantic was born. Across the ocean's mirror in Morocco, the story repeats. Volcanic dikes cut through ancient crust, hardened reminders of magma forcing its way upward during rifting. Between them lie evaporite deposits, salt, gypsum, and halite. These formed when seawater flooded into valleys and then evaporated, leaving crystalline records of the first tides. The match between North America and Africa is unmistakable. Two sides of a fracture, two halves of the same scar. This was no storm surge, no apocalyptic flood. It was slow, it was patient, yet its consequences were eternal. The supercontinent's unity was gone. Though the land still touched in places, though creatures still crossed on foot where the water had not yet won, the breach had been made, and in that breach lay the seed of a new world. Once seawater entered the rifts, the changes accelerated. Shallow, brackish zones grew into estuaries. Estuaries expanded into inland seas. With every century, the tide reached farther. The first true Atlantic Ocean was not the vast expanse we know today, but a chain of narrow gulfs and saltwater corridors stitched between rift valleys. Yet these small beginnings carried immense weight. They marked the transition from continental wholeness to continental drift. Ecosystems at the margins transformed first. Where rivers met salt, new ecological frontiers emerged. Fish accustomed to fresh water perished unless they could adapt to brackish conditions. Ammonoids and bivalves seized the opportunity, spreading into the shallow straits and flourishing in abundance. For them, the rift seas were nurseries. For others, they were tombs. Dinosaurs, still small and varied in form, paced the shifting coastlines. Trackways preserved in what is now Nova Scotia show prints pressed into wet sediment beside tidal pools. They walked the edges of a world in motion, perhaps unaware of the scale of change beneath their feet. Across the water, their relatives in Morocco left similar tracks. The prints are nearly identical, proof of shared ancestry, but also a reminder that these shores were no longer joined. The same animals stood on different continents, already divided by salt. The climate shifted with geography. New coastlines altered wind and rainfall patterns. Monsoons redirected, guided by the widening straits. Some regions, once dry, grew wetter. Others fell into drought as moist air currents changed their paths. These shifts reshaped forests and plains. Cycads and conifers thrived in the humid zones, while drought-resistant forms took hold inland. Evolutionary divergence, once driven by rainfall and microhabitat, now accelerated under the weight of geography itself. Meanwhile, the Earth's interior continued to drive the process. The Central Atlantic magmatic province erupted in repeated pulses, each flood of basalt covering thousands of square kilometers. Ash clouds darkened skies. Gases poured into the atmosphere, disrupting climate further. Some scientists believe this volcanism contributed directly to the mass extinction at the end of the Triassic, clearing ecological space for dinosaurs to rise in the Jurassic. Fire and water worked in tandem. Fire tore open the crust. Water filled the wounds. For marine life, the consequences were paradoxical. Acidification and anoxia killed many species, but those that adapted to the shifting chemistry found endless new habitats. Coral-like reefs, built by sponges and algae, grew in some rift seas. Early marine reptiles hunted in the channels. The seas were dangerous, unstable, but also fertile with opportunity. The rift valleys had become seaways. The seaways had become beginnings. The Atlantic Ocean, though fragile and narrow, was alive. It would never close again. What had been a river of stone was now a river of salt, and its current was pulling the world apart. As the seaways deepened, the fracture could no longer be mistaken for anything temporary. The Atlantic Ocean was opening, and with it, the age of continental drift began in earnest. The Garden of Pangea had split, and life would forever after be shaped by separation. In the fossil record, the story is clear. On one side of the divide, early Jurassic dinosaurs evolved into distinct forms. On the other, their relatives followed different paths. Isolation, once subtle, became permanent. Plant life mirrored this divergence. Conifers and ginkgos developed regional varieties. Ferns and cycads diversified differently depending on which side of the water they grew. These changes did not happen overnight, but over millions of years, the split etched itself into biology as deeply as into stone. Geologically, the Atlantic widened through seafloor spreading. At the mid-Atlantic ridge, molten rock rose from the mantle, cooled, and hardened into new crust. Each cycle pushed the continents farther apart. At first, the distance was measurable only in centimeters per year. But time multiplied those centimeters into kilometers. Oceans do not rush, they creep. Yet the outcome is inevitable. The continents that once embraced pulled slowly away, their edges mirrored in cliffs and coastlines now separated by thousands of kilometers of water. The environmental impact of this expansion was immense. New coastlines created new climates. Inland deserts shrank in some places, while new rain shadows formed in others. Ocean currents, shallow but strengthening, began to carry heat differently around the globe. Life on land and in the sea responded with fresh adaptations. Evolution did not wait for the ocean to widen fully. It began its work the moment the first tide rolled inland. The symbolism of this moment is hard to ignore. For hundreds of millions of years, Pangea had been the symbol of unity, a single body of land where species mingled and spread. Its breakup marked not only the end of that unity, but the beginning of diversity on a planetary scale. Once isolated, species could evolve freely. Once separated, continents could cultivate their own ecosystems. Out of fracture came abundance. Today, the legacy of that split still shapes the world. The basalt cliffs of Nova Scotia mirror those of Morocco. Identical layers of sandstone appear in Brazil and West Africa. The Atlantic Ocean may divide them now, but the rocks whisper their shared origin. They are geological siblings, parted by time and tide. What began as a crack in the garden became the most familiar ocean on Earth. The Atlantic stands as both divider and connector. It isolates continents, yet it also became the corridor across which humans would one day travel, linking civilizations that had evolved apart. Its birth was not a catastrophe. It was a transformation, a reminder that Earth's true constant is change. The garden had cracked, and in its place the sea had risen. From that sea, a new world would be born. From the waters that had risen to fill the first rifts, the continents began their slow farewell. The Atlantic, still young, widened imperceptibly with each passing year. Yet what looked like stillness to the animals that walked its shores was in truth a steady unravelling. The garden that had cracked was now being pulled apart, and with every centimetre of drift, life itself was being rewritten. For creatures that once roamed freely across the breadth of Pangea, the separation brought new boundaries. Herds that had grazed across the same plains now found themselves split by salt water. Predators that once tracked their prey across continents were confined to narrower ranges. The process was not dramatic, not sudden, but insistent. Evolution responds not to speed but to pressure, and here the pressure was distance. Dinosaurs, already diverse in the Triassic, began to follow different evolutionary scripts. On the western shores of the New Atlantic, small theropods evolved unique adaptations in limb structure and feeding strategy. Across the water, their eastern relatives developed differently, shaped by climates that were now diverging as coastlines formed. A single lineage, once widespread, was being tugged in two directions by nothing more than geography. In time, these differences would accumulate until kinship was no longer obvious. They would no longer be the same. Plants mirrored this divergence. Conifers that once spread across the unified continent began to adapt separately to their environments. In wetter coastal regions, broad-needled varieties thrived. In the interior, dry adapted forms hardened against drought. Spores and seeds that might once have spread freely were now confined by oceans. Forests on one side of the divide became strangers to forests on the other. Even the pollen grains, when fossilized, tell of this growing difference. They no longer match as perfectly as they once did. In the seas, too, the divergence began. Ammonoids and bivalves, carried by currents, found themselves in isolated basins as coastlines shifted. Some flourished in the nutrient-rich waters of the New Atlantic, while others declined in stagnant inland seas. Isolation shaped even the oceans, fragmenting life into separate chapters. The unravelling was not only ecological, but climatic. As continents pulled apart, new wind patterns emerged. Rains that once swept broadly across Pangea now broke into regional monsoons. Northern lands grew cooler, southern ones warmer. Forest belts shifted. Deserts expanded. Each change in rainfall altered the map of survival, pushing species toward distinct futures. It was a long goodbye, one so drawn out that no creature living then could have noticed it. A dinosaur's life spanned perhaps a few decades. A conifer might stand for centuries, yet none could perceive the slow pulling of the land beneath their feet. What they lived was continuity. What the earth was writing was division. The continents had begun to part, and in that parting, the unity of life unravelled with them. As the split deepened, ecosystems once united began to fracture, into isolated theatres of evolution. The great migration routes of the Triassic, which had allowed animals to wander from what is now North America to Africa or Europe without obstruction, closed forever. The Atlantic widened into a corridor of separation. Every tide, every current reinforced the distance. Dinosaurs bore the clearest witness to this divergence. In western lands, early sauropodomorphs grew larger, adapting to open plains with long necks that could sweep across vast areas of vegetation. On the eastern side, their relatives remained smaller, navigating denser forests where agility mattered more than size. Both traced their ancestry to the same Triassic forms, yet each followed paths dictated by geography and climate. The Atlantic was not simply water. It was a mirror that reflected difference. Predatory dinosaurs also began to diverge. Small, fast theropods on the western continent experimented with new hunting strategies, evolving sharper claws and lighter frames for speed. On the opposite shore, their kin developed heavier builds and jaws adapted for larger prey. Millions of years later, these divergences would give rise to the iconic lineages of the Jurassic. But their roots lay in this slow separation. Marine reptiles exploited the new coastlines in their own way. Along the narrow Atlantic margins, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs prowled shallow waters, hunting fish that gathered in tidal estuaries. Inland, cut-off seas became homes to entirely different lineages, their evolution sealed by isolation. Fossil beds today reveal this division. The skeletons of marine reptiles in South America differ markedly from those of Europe and Africa, despite their shared ancestry. The plants followed the same trajectory. Cycads and ginkgos spread unevenly. Their seeds carried only as far as currents or winds allowed. On the western continent, cycads formed broad belts of subtropical vegetation. On the eastern, conifers dominated, shaping landscapes that would guide herbivores along distinct dietary paths. Herbivorous dinosaurs adapted accordingly. Teeth flattened or sharpened, jaws lengthened or shortened. The forest dictated the feeder, and the feeder reshaped the forest. Climate change compounded the division. With new oceans forming, heat and moisture circulated differently. Monsoons broke into smaller regional systems. Storms gained new strength over the widening Atlantic. Floodplains that had once been fertile shrank under drought. Ecosystems shifted like sand under wind, forcing adaptations that diverged further with each passing generation. The evidence of this long goodbye lies in the rocks. Fossils of the same genus appearing on both sides of the Atlantic grow rarer as time passes. Where once the match was precise, now it is approximate. By the Middle Jurassic, the divide is complete. Species on one side no longer mirror those on the other. Evolution had accepted the separation. The continents were not only moving apart, they were becoming biologically different worlds. The unraveling of Pangea's unity was not abrupt, but it was final. Each centimetre of drift carried with it a deepening of ecological solitude. The Atlantic Ocean, once a chain of shallow gulfs, stretched wider with every epoch. By the early Jurassic, it was no longer a fragile seaway, but a growing oceanic divide. And across that divide, lineages of life marched into futures that would never again converge. On the western continents, sauropods expanded into giants. Their bones, later preserved in the Morrison Formation of North America, reveal creatures that towered above forests, their necks sweeping like cranes across treetops. On the eastern lands, sauropods evolved too, but along different lines, producing forms better adapted to lush coastal lowlands. Both had sprung from the same ancestors, yet the distance ensured their stories would never meet again. Theropods also diverged. In Europe and Africa, they honed their roles as apex predators in wetter, forested environments. In North America, drier climates favored lighter, faster hunters that could track prey across open plains. Over millions of years, the separation grew into distinction. The same pattern repeated in smaller reptiles, amphibians, and insects. Once shared designs branched into unique regional solutions. Marine ecosystems reflected the same slow goodbye. Along Africa's coasts, plesiosaurs adapted to shallow lagoons. In North America, ichthyosaurs thrived in deeper offshore waters. The The differences in their body shapes, feeding strategies, and even reproductive habits reflected ecosystems sculpted by geography. The Atlantic was young, but it was already shaping life as powerfully as mountains or deserts had done before. Plants anchored these divisions. Ginkgo forests flourished in temperate zones of the east, while conifers spread across the western lands. Each lineage of herbivore adapted to its local flora. In turn, predators followed, refining their strategies to match the prey that geography had supplied. Evolution does not waste opportunity. It molds each creature to the environment it inherits, and those environments were now diverging inexorably. The breakup of Pangea created not only physical oceans, but oceans of time between lineages. Isolation is a patient teacher. Small differences, left unchallenged by migration or genetic mixing, deepen with every generation. Teeth sharpen differently, bones lengthen or shorten, instincts shift, until populations that once shared a homeland become strangers to each other. That is the true meaning of divergence. It is not an instant. It is a farewell that never ends. The long goodbye of Pangea shaped the course of life forever. Without it, the diversity of the Jurassic and beyond would never have unfolded. From the sorrow of division came the beauty of variety. The supercontinent had fractured, but from its fracture, the living world grew richer. The landmasses peeled apart, the ecosystems unraveled, and life, in its patient resilience, rewrote itself on separate pages of the Earth's story. The continents had pulled apart, their ecosystems unraveling into separate tapestries of life, yet the memory of unity lingered. Even as oceans widened and species diverged, the Earth still bore the fingerprints of its ancient wholeness. Pangea might have fractured, but its ghosts remained, inscribed in stone, in bone, and in the living world itself. One of the clearest echoes lies in geology. The mountains that stretch across eastern North America tell the same story as those of Morocco and Western Europe. The Appalachian chain, though now worn and softened by erosion, once stood tall against the Hercynian and Variscan ranges across the Atlantic. They are not separate by chance. They are the broken halves of a single mountain belt, stitched together when Pangea formed, torn apart when it died. To walk the ridges of Maine or the cliffs of Brittany is to trace the same scar, split by water but united by origin. The fossil record deepens this connection. In strata from the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic, paleontologists uncover identical species on continents now separated by oceans. Glossopteris, a seed fern once common across the southern lands, appears in India, South America, Africa, and Antarctica. Its broad leaves, preserved in stone, testify to a time when those continents were joined in the southern reaches of Pangea. Mesosaurus, a small freshwater reptile, left its remains in both Brazil and Namibia. It could never have crossed an ocean. The explanation is simple. There was no ocean then, only rivers and lakes stretching across a united world. Even the rocks beneath the seas whisper of Pangea's past. Magnetic patterns, frozen in basalt on the ocean floor, align only when the continents are fitted back together. These stripes, alternating in polarity, reveal the slow dance of seafloor spreading that carried the continents apart. They are geological memories, invisible to the eye, but undeniable to science. The ghost of Pangea is not confined to evidence alone. It lives in patterns. Species on different continents, though now distinct, carry echoes of shared ancestry. Crocodilians in Africa and the Americas, marsupials in South America and Australia, lungfishes in Africa, South America, and Australia, all trace their lineages to a time when seas had not yet divided them. They are living fossils of connection, separated by geography, but joined by history. For those who study Earth's past, these echoes are more than curiosities. They are proof that the Earth was once whole. They bind continents not only in imagination, but in evidence. To hold a fossil fern in Antarctica, or to match the fold of a mountain in Canada with one in Scotland, is to see the ghost directly. The supercontinent may be gone, but it never left entirely. It remains in fragments, like shattered glass that still hints at the shape of the original vessel. The traces left behind are not just geological or biological, they are also atmospheric. The very climate systems we know today carry the imprint of Pangea's existence. When the continents split, ocean currents reorganized, wind belts shifted, monsoons fractured into regional systems, yet the ghosts of those earlier patterns still haunt the skies. Deserts like the Sahara, which once lay at the heart of Pangea's arid interior, carry on the memory of climates forged in supercontinental scale. Their sands, older than the Atlantic itself, are relics of that ancient dryness. Shared flora and fauna speak the same language. Fossilized pollen, carried on winds millions of years ago, appears in layers across continents that no longer touch. The distribution of early reptiles, amphibians, and even insects reflects a once unified landmass. Even today, similarities persist. The oak and beech forests of Europe and North America, though separated by an ocean, reveal a kinship rooted in Pangea's legacy. Their ancestors spread freely before the divide. The lineages parted, but never forgot. In human history, these connections have shaped understanding of the planet. For centuries, the jigsaw fit of Africa and South America puzzled observers. Philosophers speculated on a lost continent. Sailors traced coastlines that seemed too neatly aligned to be coincidence. It was not until the 20th century that plate tectonics provided the answer, but the intuition was older. People sensed that the Earth carried memory, that the continents were not random scatterings but fragments of a single whole. This recognition sparked something more than science. It ignited imagination. To know that mountains in Appalachia once touched those in Morocco, or that ferns in Antarctica once shared soil with those in India, is to feel a kind of psychological awe. Pangea became more than a scientific fact. It became an idea that the Earth itself had once been simpler, unified, singular. The ghost is also cultural. Myths of great floods and shifting lands echo across civilizations. While these stories are not literal records of Pangea, they reveal a deep human instinct to sense that the world changes beneath our feet. The awareness of shifting land, whether through earthquake, volcano, or coastlines altered by sea, ties into the deeper truth of tectonics. Cultures felt the instability of Earth long before they had words for plates or plumes. In this way, the ghost of the supercontinent is not confined to rocks and bones. It lives in memory, in story, and in imagination. It speaks to our awareness that unity is fragile, that what seems permanent may dissolve with time. To reflect on Pangea is to confront impermanence on a planetary scale. It is to acknowledge that the land beneath us moves, and that all we see today is temporary. Perhaps the most profound ghost of Pangea is the reminder that the Earth is cyclical. The continents gathered once before, and they will gather again. Geologists speak of the supercontinent cycle, a rhythm of assembly and breakup spanning hundreds of millions of years. Pangea was not the first, nor will it be the last. Before it came Rodinia, before Rodinia came Nuna, and even earlier supercontinents have left traces. After Pangea will come Pangea Ultima, Amarcia, or Novo Pangea, names given to futures where the continents reunite in new configurations. The ghost of Pangea lingers because it is not finished. It is part of a cycle that continues to breathe through deep time. The psychological weight of this idea is immense. To know that the Earth was once whole and will be whole again alters perspective. Our maps, our borders, our sense of place, all are temporary. The Atlantic Ocean that now divides families of species will one day close. New mountains will rise where seas once lay. The cycle will erase what seems eternal and replace it with something both familiar and strange. In the present, the evidence of Pangea's ghost helps us understand the world we inhabit. The mirrored geology of coasts, the shared ancestry of lineages, the echoes in climate, all of it is a reminder that the Earth is not fixed. For scientists, this knowledge explains patterns of biodiversity, guides searches for resources, and unravels the mysteries of past extinctions. For the rest of us, it whispers of belonging to a planet that moves and remembers. Standing on a modern shoreline, looking across an ocean, it is possible to imagine the unity that once was. The rocks beneath your feet may be twins of those across the sea. The fossils embedded in them may have relatives far away. reminders of a time when the distance was not there. These connections are quiet, but they endure. The ghost of Pangea is not haunting in the sense of tragedy, it is haunting in the sense of presence. It lingers, visible in every mirrored coastline, every shared species, every matching fold of mountain. It reminds us that Earth is alive, not static, and that we live in a chapter, not the whole book. To see its traces is to glimpse the continuity of the planet's story, stretching back beyond imagination and forward into futures we will never see. The continents may be apart, but they carry within them the memory of being one. That memory is etched into stone, written in biology, and carried in the human imagination. The supercontinent is gone, but its ghost walks with us still, whispering of unity, reminding us that Earth remembers. The continents may be apart, but they carry within them the memory of being one. That memory shapes not only our view of the past, but our imagination of the future. If Earth has assembled supercontinents before, and if Pangea was not the first, then logic compels us to wonder what comes next. For the plates do not stop moving. They drift across the mantle like rafts on a restless sea, their trajectories slow but unstoppable, and in time, they may gather once again. Scientists call this process the supercontinent cycle. Roughly every 400 to 600 million years, the drifting fragments of Earth's crust collide, merge, fracture, and then reunite in a new arrangement. Rodinia gave way to Pannotia, Pannotia to Pangea, Pangea to our present globe of scattered lands. The cycle continues, indifferent to the brevity of human history. The maps we know are only one frame in a film that stretches across billions of years. The question then arises, what will the next supercontinent look like? Models differ, but they share one conviction. Unless Earth itself cools and its tectonic engine slows to silence, the plates will not stay scattered forever. Already, hints of this motion are visible. The Atlantic continues to widen, its floor spreading as new crust forms at the mid-Atlantic ridge. Meanwhile, the Pacific shrinks, subduction zones consuming its floor at the edges of Asia and the Americas. These opposing movements set the stage for a future collision. One vision imagines Pangea Proxima, a supercontinent that will form when the Atlantic closes again. In this scenario, the Americas drift eastward, colliding once more with Africa and Europe. The cycle would turn full circle. The ocean that was born in fire and rift valleys would vanish into trenches, and the continents that once kissed would meet again. If this future comes to pass, the Atlantic's days are numbered, and the memory of its birth is also the story of its death. Another possibility is Amasia, a landmass predicted to form around the North Pole. Here, the continents of the Northern Hemisphere might slowly creep toward each other, drawn by the shrinking Arctic Ocean. North America, Europe, and Asia could fuse into one crown of land, leaving the southern continents scattered around a global sea. This future supercontinent would not replicate Pangea. It would be something new, shaped by the momentum of today's drift. Other models describe Novo Pangea, a configuration in which the Pacific closes instead. South America continues its push westward, colliding with Australia and Asia. North America follows, wrapping around to join Eurasia from the other side. In this vision, the Pacific's vastness shrinks to nothing, and the continents meet in a ring. The Atlantic remains, but the Earth is reshaped into a new geometry, one no human eye will see. Each possibility is speculative, yet each is grounded in evidence. The cycle does not lie. The continents are still moving, and eventually they will gather. The dream of reunion is written in stone. Speculating about these future supercontinents is more than an exercise in cartography. It is a meditation on the persistence of change. Our species has existed for only a blink of geologic time, yet already we think of coastlines and continents as permanent. We map them, we draw borders across them, we anchor identities in them. But Earth is patient. It ignores our lines. It moves at a scale so vast that permanence is an illusion. To imagine Pangea, Proxima, or Amasia is to imagine climates, unlike any we know. Supercontinents are not merely landmasses, they are climate engines. When Pangea existed, its interior baked under relentless heat, cut off from oceanic moderation. If a new supercontinent forms, the same may happen again. Interiors could become deserts larger than any now known, while coastlines might face monsoons of staggering intensity. Species that survive such climates would be shaped by them, just as the reptiles of Pangea adapted to scarcity and heat. Biodiversity would follow its own trajectory. Isolation and reconnection both play roles in evolution. When continents join, lineages mix, compete, and sometimes vanish. When continents separate, diversity increases through isolation. A new supercontinent would create both effects. Ecosystems now divided by oceans would meet. Predators and prey unfamiliar to each other would clash. Plants would spread into new soils, and in the crucible of competition, new forms of life would emerge. For Earth, every reunion is also a rebirth. The psychological weight of this vision is striking. To think that the continents we know are temporary unsettles the human sense of permanence. Cities, nations, cultures, all are tied to geography. Yet in tens of millions of years, those geographies will be gone. Our monuments will crumble. Our maps will be obsolete. The mountains will shift, and seas will swallow coastlines. The earth will not keep what we build. It will only keep moving. Yet there is comfort in this impermanence. The cycle that broke Pangea also created the diversity of life we inherit. Without separation, there would be no unique flora and fauna on different continents. Without drift, there would be no story of evolution as we know it. The Earth's restlessness is the engine of its creativity. It forgets, but it also invents. Each fracture is an ending, each reunion a beginning. From our perspective, these futures are unimaginable in their distance. 1,000,000 years is beyond our recorded history. 100 million is beyond comprehension. And yet, for the Earth, these spans are moments. The continents dream slowly, but they dream nonetheless. Their reunion is inevitable, even if no human eyes remain to see it. The question is not whether the Earth will change again. The question is whether it ever stops. The answer, as far as we can tell, is no. Earth does not stop. Its breath is long, but it never ceases. The continents drift because the mantle moves. The mantle moves because the core burns. And the core burns because the Earth is still alive with the heat of its creation. Until that heat fades, until the planet cools into silence, the cycle will continue. Assembly, breakup, reunion, breath in, breath out. What does it mean to live on such a planet? For us, it means humility. The land beneath our feet feels immovable, but it is not. The Atlantic Ocean that seems eternal is only a chapter. The mountains that rise like monuments are temporary folds, already wearing down. Even the deserts, seas, and forests we think of as ancient are transient expressions of deeper forces. Earth's surface is a palimpsest, written over and over by tectonics, volcanism, and time. For future supercontinents, the cycle will not only reshape land, but also redefine oceans. When Pangea Proxima forms, if it does, the Atlantic will close. Its floor, so young compared to continental crust, will be consumed at subduction zones. New mountains will rise along the collision lines. The Pacific, if it endures, will dominate the globe. If Nova Pangea forms instead, the Pacific will vanish. Its ancient floor, scarred by trenches and ridges, will sink into the mantle. The Atlantic will remain, but continents will cluster in a new geometry. Each version carries its own climates, ecosystems, and mysteries. Geologists debate which model is most likely, but all agree on the underlying truth. Change is certain, stability is illusion. The continents do not rest. They only pause between movements, and we live in one such pause, mistaking it for permanence. To reflect on Pangea is to reflect on continuity. Its ghosts still linger in mountain belts and fossil beds. Its breakup gave us the world we know. But its story also points forward. Another supercontinent waits in the deep future. Another unity will form, and with it, another unraveling. The Earth is not a finished canvas. It is a work in progress, always erasing, always redrawing. For humanity, the cycle stretches beyond imagination. We will not see Pangea Proxima rise, nor a Musia crown the pole. But to know they may come is to glimpse the patience of the planet. It teaches us that our place is fleeting, that our maps are temporary, that our certainties are fragile. Yet it also offers a strange kind of reassurance. Change is not chaos. It is rhythm. It is the earth breathing. The continents drift apart. They dream of reunion. They will gather again. And the story will continue, long after we are gone. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this ancient road through the breath and break of Earth, for tracing the echo of a world once whole, and dreaming with us of the one it might become again. If this story gave you a moment of wonder, a spark of focus, or even the quiet comfort of perspective, I'm grateful you spent this time with us. I wonder what fragment of this journey will stay with you. Was it a glimpse of ancient skies? Or the hush before the first drift? The scent of rain over a splitting garden? The shadow of a reptile where desert meets forest? The breath of continents still turning in their sleep? If a single image or question stayed with you, I'd love to hear it in the comments. These reflections are what build our quiet community, one echo at a time. Feel free to like, share, or subscribe if you'd like to keep wandering deeper into stories that live beneath the surface. There's always another fossil to uncover, another future waiting in the cracks. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,